It was late September when I decided to take a solo camping trip into the woods. I had been feeling restless for weeks, stuck in the same routine at work, and I wanted to get away from everything. I didn't pick a popular campsite. I didn't want picnic tables, RV hookups, or the sound of other people's radios at night. I wanted quiet. I wanted to hear the wind in the trees and nothing else. The place I chose was a state forest about 3 hours from home. I had been there before on day hikes, but I had never camped deep inside it. Most people stayed near the main trails, but I planned to walk further in, to a spot I had marked on a map where the forest grew thicker and the nearest road was miles away. There were no official campsites there, just wilderness. The air was cool when I parked my truck on the edge of a gravel pull-off near the trailhead. The sky was overcast, and the breeze was strong enough to move the branches overhead. I strapped on my pack, locked up the truck, and started down the trail. The dirt path was still damp from rain the night before, and in some places, my boots sank into the mud. I could smell wet leaves and pine needles. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. After a while, the only sound was my own footsteps. The trail narrowed as I moved further in, until it was little more than a faint line through the undergrowth. I followed it for about an hour before I left it entirely, using the compass to head toward my marked spot. The trees became denser, the light dimmer. A few times I had to stop and push branches aside or step over fallen logs. I noticed animal tracks in the mud, deer, raccoon, maybe coyote. When I reached the spot I had chosen, it was exactly as I remembered from the map's elevation lines. A small clearing surrounded by tall pines and oaks, with a slope on one side that dropped down toward a creek. The creek wasn't visible from the clearing, but I could hear it faintly in the distance. I set down my pack, stretched my shoulders, and started setting up my tent. It took about 30 minutes to get everything ready. I laid out my sleeping bag inside, placed my food in a bear canister, and made a small fire pit with stones from around the clearing. The air was cooler up here, and the wind occasionally rushed through the treetops with a low, distant roar. I collected dry branches and deadfall, stacking them in a small pile for later. By the time I had eaten my simple dinner, just dehydrated chili and some bread, it was getting dark. The fire was small, just enough for warmth and light. The shadows beyond the circle of light seemed to move as the flames flickered. I sat with my back against a log, staring into the fire and listening to the faint trickle of the creek far below. That's when I heard something. It was faint at first, a rustling sound, far off in the trees. I assumed it was an animal. Out here, that was normal. Squirrels, deer, raccoons, they all moved through the woods at night. But after a few minutes, I realized the sound wasn't random. It was steady, slow, like footsteps. They would come for a few seconds, stop, then start again. Always in the same direction, off to my left, somewhere past the clearing. I leaned forward, listening harder. The sound stopped. I stayed still, letting the fire crackle softly. After a while, I shrugged it off and told myself it was just my imagination. Out here, alone, the mind could play tricks. But about 20 minutes later, I heard it again. Closer. This time, I turned my head toward the sound and stared into the darkness. My firelight didn't reach far, and the moon was hidden behind clouds. I couldn't see anything. I picked up my flashlight and flicked it on, shining it toward the trees. For a second, all I saw were trunks and branches. Then, maybe I imagined it, I thought I saw something pale slip behind a tree. I told myself it was probably a deer's flank catching the light. Still, my pulse sped up. I kept the flashlight trained on the spot, waiting. Nothing moved. After a minute, I lowered it, telling myself I was being paranoid. The rest of the night passed quietly, but I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up to every little sound outside. Once I heard a distant snapping of twigs. Another time, a soft thud, like something heavy landing on the ground. But nothing came into the clearing. In the morning, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside into cool, gray light. The fire had gone cold. I walked to the edge of the clearing, stretching my legs. That's when I saw them. Footprints. They weren't boot prints like mine, and they weren't from an animal. They were bare feet, human. The prints came from the trees, stopped a few yards from my tent, and then turned back the way they came. My stomach tightened as I crouched down to look closer. The prints were deep enough to be fresh, maybe from last night. The ground was still damp, so the edges of the prints hadn't dried or crumbled yet. Whoever it was had walked right up to my camp in the dark. I stood there for a long time, scanning the trees. The forest was silent except for the wind high in the branches. I thought about packing up and leaving, but it was early, and I had planned to stay 2 more nights. I told myself maybe it was another hiker who got turned around, saw my camp, and left. Still, the idea of someone out here barefoot, in the dark, unsettled me. I decided to keep my food close that day and not wander too far from camp. I spent most of the morning gathering more firewood and checking my surroundings. I followed the footprints for a little while, but they vanished on dry leaves before I could see where they led. Around noon, I went down the slope to the creek to fill my water filter. The air felt cooler down there, the ground soft with moss. The water was clear and cold. I knelt, filling my bottles, when I heard something behind me. It was that same slow, deliberate rustling. I turned sharply, scanning the bank. The trees were thick here, and I couldn't see far. The sound stopped again. I waited, heart pounding, but nothing came into view. Finally, I finished filling the bottles and climbed back up to the clearing, glancing over my shoulder every few steps. By late afternoon, the sky had darkened with heavy clouds. The wind picked up, and I could smell rain coming. I reinforced the tent stakes and stacked my firewood under a tarp. That night, I kept the fire bigger than before. The light flickered over the trees, and I sat with my back to the tent so I could see in all directions. For a long time, nothing happened. The rain started just after midnight, a steady patter on the tarp and leaves. I stayed awake, listening. At some point, I must have dozed off in my chair, because I woke with a start to a sound that cut through the rain. A snapping twig, very close. I froze. Then another sound, a soft, wet slap, like a bare foot in mud. I grabbed my flashlight and swung it toward the trees. For a split second, I saw something. Pale skin, a human shape, low to the ground. Then it moved out of the beam. My breath caught. I stood slowly, keeping the light trained on the dark. I couldn't see it anymore, but I heard it moving, circling the edge of the clearing. I didn't shout. I didn't move toward it. I just stood there, heart hammering, trying to see where it would go. The sound stopped. The rain kept falling. When nothing happened for several minutes, I backed into the tent and zipped it closed, keeping the flashlight in my hand. I stayed awake until dawn. In the morning, more footprints, closer this time. They went halfway around my tent before disappearing back into the woods. That was enough. I packed my gear in record time, my hands shaking as I stuffed everything into my pack. I didn't bother with breakfast. I just wanted out. The hike back felt twice as long. I kept glancing over my shoulder, sure I was being followed. Several times I thought I saw movement far back in the trees, but it was too quick to be certain. When I finally reached my truck, I tossed my pack in the bed and climbed inside, locking the doors. My hands were wet with sweat even though the air was cold. I sat there for a few minutes, staring at the trailhead, half expecting to see someone emerge. No one did. I drove away, watching the forest in my mirrors until the trees were gone. I never went back to that part of the state forest again. Even now, years later, I think about those bare footprints in the mud and the sound of them moving through the dark rain. Whoever it was, they had been watching me, and they had been getting closer. It had been a long week at work, and the idea of getting away from everything seemed perfect. I had planned a weekend camping trip for months, circling dates on the calendar until I finally saw an opening. I wanted somewhere remote, away from roads, away from the noise of people, somewhere I could just hear the wind and water. I had chosen a spot deep in the forest near an old river bend, a place I had found once on a day hike but never camped at before. I remembered the air there feeling cooler, even in the heat, and the sound of the water echoing through the trees. That Friday afternoon, I packed my gear in the back of my old SUV. My tent, sleeping bag, stove, food, first aid kit, spare clothes, and a folding chair. I filled 2 large bottles with water and threw in a filter just in case. The weather forecast said it would be warm during the day and drop down to the low 50s at night. I thought it would be perfect. I left work early, trying to get there before sunset so I could set up camp in daylight. The drive was long, 2 hours on the highway and another 45 minutes down a twisting gravel road that grew narrower the deeper I went. The trees on either side started leaning over the road, their branches reaching above me like a green tunnel. I slowed down when I hit a section of deep ruts, feeling the car shake and bump. The forest was thick, the kind where light barely reached the ground, and the smell of pine was heavy. I reached a small clearing I had marked on my GPS as the parking spot. From there, it was a half-mile walk down a barely visible trail to the river bend. I hoisted my backpack, locked the car, and started walking. The trail was uneven, covered in roots and scattered rocks. I could hear birds deeper in the woods, and every now and then, something moving quickly through the undergrowth, probably squirrels or rabbits. The air felt cooler as I got closer to the water. The trail opened up, and there it was, the river bending in a wide curve with a small gravel bar along the inside edge. The current was slow, and I could see small fish darting near the surface. On the other side, the bank rose steeply into thick woods. I found a flat spot about 20 yards from the water, shaded by a few tall pines, and dropped my pack. I pitched the tent, making sure it was anchored well in the slightly sandy soil. I unrolled my sleeping bag inside, set my gear in one corner, and put the stove and food outside. I walked down to the river and cupped some water in my hands, feeling how cold it was. The sound of it moving over the rocks was steady and calming. As the sun lowered, the shadows stretched long, and the air cooled fast. I cooked a quick meal, pasta with a pouch of chicken, and ate it slowly, sitting on a flat rock facing the water. There was no phone signal here, which was exactly what I wanted. It felt good to be completely cut off, surrounded by nothing but trees and water. When darkness came, it came fast. The temperature dropped, and the sounds of the day faded into the steady hum of crickets and the occasional splash from the river. I had a small fire going, just enough for light and a bit of warmth. I sat in my chair watching the flames, feeling that deep stillness you only get in the middle of nowhere. It was late, maybe close to midnight, when I decided to turn in. I doused the fire with water, made sure nothing was smoldering, and zipped myself inside the tent. The sleeping bag felt warm, and I drifted off quickly to the sound of the river. I woke up a few hours later to a sound I couldn't place. At first, I thought it was just the river changing tone, maybe from a gust of wind. But then I realized it was different, slow, deliberate steps in the gravel near the water. My first thought was deer, maybe coming down to drink. I lay still, listening. The steps were heavy, too heavy for deer, and they had a certain crunch to them, like boots on rock. I tried to convince myself it might be another camper, but I hadn't seen a single car on the way in, and the nearest public campsite was miles away. The steps paused. I could hear the soft rush of the river and nothing else. Then, the sound of rocks shifting again, this time closer, moving along the bank toward my tent. Every instinct told me not to move. My breathing slowed, and I listened as the sound came within maybe 15 feet. Then it stopped again. There was a long silence. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. Then, a sharp scrape, like something dragging against a stone. It lasted only a second. Another pause. My mind was racing now, running through possibilities. A hiker? A hunter? Someone lost? But the steps sounded too slow, too deliberate, as if whoever it was trying not to be heard. After a few minutes, the sound faded back toward the water. I waited a long time before I moved, staring at the dark fabric of the tent, imagining shadows outside. I didn't sleep much after that, just dozed in short bursts until the faint light of morning came. When I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, the air was damp and cold. The gravel bar looked untouched at first, but when I walked closer, I saw them. Footprints. Not bare feet, but boots wide and deep enough to belong to someone much heavier than me. They came up from the water's edge, stopped near the line of trees, and turned back. The pattern was odd, not straight, more like the person had taken short, angled steps. I felt uneasy, but I told myself it could have been someone fishing at night. Still, the fact they had come so close without making themselves known didn't sit right. I spent most of that day trying to shake the feeling. I fished in the river, hiked a little upstream, and gathered wood for another fire. But every time I heard something in the brush, my eyes went to the tree line, scanning for movement. I kept noticing how quiet the forest felt, almost too quiet. That night, I built the fire higher, letting it throw more light. I ate dinner, sat by the flames, and kept my headlamp close. I stayed up later than usual, hoping that if someone or something came back, I'd be awake to hear it. Around 1 in the morning, I finally crawled into my tent, leaving the dying fire to glow outside. It was maybe an hour later when I woke again, this time to a different sound. Not footsteps, breathing. Slow, heavy breathing, just outside the tent wall. My skin went cold instantly. I didn't move, barely even blinked. The breathing was low, almost like a growl at the end of each exhale. It lasted for what felt like a full minute. Then came the sound of fabric, the faint, almost imperceptible rustle of the tent wall being touched from the outside. I clenched my hands in the sleeping bag. My knife was in my pack, just out of reach. The touch stopped, replaced by the sound of retreating steps, moving toward the water again. When morning came, I checked the area. More boot prints in the gravel, this time closer to the tent, some circling toward the trees before vanishing into the undergrowth. I decided I'd had enough. I packed my gear fast, constantly glancing at the woods. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming now, like the trees themselves were holding something just out of sight. When I finally got back to the car, I tossed my pack inside, started the engine, and drove without stopping until I hit pavement. Only when I saw other cars did my shoulders start to loosen. I never saw who it was. I never found out if it was a hiker, a hunter, or someone with worse intentions. All I knew was that they had come close enough to breathe against my tent wall in the middle of the night, and never said a single word. And that was enough for me to know I'd never camp there again. It was late September when I decided to go camping alone in the mountains. The weather had been cooling down for weeks, and I wanted to get one last trip in before it became too cold at night. I picked a spot I had been to once before, years ago, with a group of friends. This time, I was going alone. I liked the quiet, and I liked not having to work around anyone else's schedule. It would just be me, my gear, and the woods. I packed carefully the night before. I brought a small 2-person tent, a sleeping bag rated for cold nights, a foam pad for the ground, a camping stove, and just enough food for 2 nights. My pack felt heavier than I remembered it being on other trips, but that was probably because I had packed extra water in case the stream near the site was low. I also made sure my flashlight had fresh batteries and threw in a headlamp as a backup. A folding knife, a lighter, a map, and my phone went in the outer pockets of my bag where I could reach them easily. The drive to the trailhead took almost 2 hours. The last stretch was along a narrow dirt road that climbed up into the hills. I passed no other cars. It was the middle of the week, so I didn't expect to see many people, if any, out there. I parked in the small gravel lot, slung my pack on my back, and started up the trail. The hike in was about 3 miles. The first mile was uphill, with tree roots crossing the path and loose rocks underfoot. The forest smelled like damp leaves and pine. I could hear the occasional rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush. As I went deeper in, the sounds of the road faded until there was nothing but the crunch of my boots on the dirt and the occasional creak of the trees swaying in the breeze. By the time I reached the clearing where I planned to set up camp, the sun was dipping lower, throwing long shadows through the trees. The clearing was about 20 yards across, with grass that came up to my knees and a few scattered stumps from old logging. The ground was uneven, but I found a flat spot near the edge and set my pack down. I pitched my tent, drove the stakes into the ground, and laid out my sleeping bag inside. Once camp was set, I took a short walk to the stream I remembered from last time. It was about 5 minutes away, down a slight slope. The water was clear and cold, running over smooth stones. I filled my bottle, filtered the water, and took a long drink. When I turned to head back, I noticed how quiet it was. Too quiet. Even the birds had stopped making noise. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe it was just that time of evening when the woods settled down. Back at camp, I lit my stove and heated up a can of chili. As I ate, I noticed the shadows getting longer and the air cooling quickly. By the time I cleaned up and put my food away in a bag I hung from a tree branch, the sun had fully set. The clearing was now surrounded by darkness, with only the faint glow of the moon making out the shapes of the trees. I sat for a while just listening. Every now and then, I thought I heard something moving out there. Soft, irregular sounds like a foot dragging through leaves. At first, I figured it was just an animal, maybe a deer. I tried not to think too much about it. Still, the sounds were hard to ignore when they came from different directions at different times. Around 9 p.m., I crawled into my tent. I left my headlamp hanging from the ceiling inside so I could flick it on if I needed to. I zipped the tent shut, lay down, and pulled the sleeping bag up to my chin. The night air had a bite to it, and I could feel the cold seeping through the ground even with the foam pad under me. I must have drifted off because the next thing I knew, I was awake again. My eyes opened to darkness, and it took me a second to realize what had woken me. There it was, the sound of something moving through the clearing. It wasn't fast, and it wasn't constant. It was a step, a pause, another step. Dry grass crunching under weight. I stayed still, barely breathing. My mind ran through possibilities. A deer? Maybe. But deer tended to move quickly, not like this slow, deliberate pace. My second thought was a bear, which made my stomach tighten. The food was hung high, but I'd heard bears could still be curious. I reached for my knife, keeping it in my hand under the sleeping bag. The steps grew closer, then stopped. I could hear nothing but the sound of my own pulse in my ears. I waited. After maybe a minute, there was the faintest sound of something brushing against the side of my tent, like fingertips trailing across the fabric. My heart started hammering. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe for a moment. Whatever it was, it circled partway around the tent, slow enough that I could follow the sound. Then it stopped again. I strained my ears but heard nothing else for what felt like forever. Eventually, I told myself it must have wandered off, though I didn't entirely believe it. Sleep didn't come easy after that. I lay there, listening for every little sound, every snap of a twig, every shift of the wind. At some point, I dozed off again, but it was restless, shallow sleep. When morning came, the clearing looked calm and harmless. My food bag was untouched, and there were no obvious signs of anything around the tent. Still, when I stepped out, I noticed faint impressions in the grass. They weren't clear enough to tell exactly what made them, but they were definitely from something bigger than a raccoon. I decided to stay one more night as planned, but be extra careful. I spent the day hiking a loop trail nearby, keeping an eye out for other campers. I saw no one. Back at camp in the late afternoon, I cooked early, cleaned up well, and kept my fire small so it wouldn't draw too much attention. The second night, I went to bed while it was still a little light out, figuring I'd get some rest before anything could disturb me. But sure enough, sometime in the middle of the night, I woke again to the sound of movement. This time it was faster, more erratic. Circled the tent, stopped, then circled again. My grip tightened on the knife. Then I heard it, low breathing just outside the fabric. Not animal snorting or huffing. Steady, controlled breathing. I froze. My mind raced. I had no cell service. My tent zipper seemed impossibly loud in my imagination, so I didn't move it. I lay there, every muscle tense, until the sound drifted away into the trees. I stayed awake until first light, then packed up fast. I didn't eat, didn't take my time, just shoved everything into my pack and left. I didn't stop until I reached my car, my back prickling the whole way like something was still behind me. When I finally drove out of the lot and hit the paved road, I let out a long breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. I never found out who or what had been out there with me, but I knew it wasn't just an animal, and I knew I wasn't going camping alone again anytime soon. It was early October when I decided to head out for a weekend camping trip. The summer heat had faded, the air was cooler, and the forests were quiet. I wanted to be somewhere far away from people, somewhere I could just hear the wind and my own breathing. I'd been feeling restless for weeks, stuck in my daily routine, and the thought of empty trails and cold nights felt like the right kind of escape. I drove out before sunrise, heading toward a stretch of wilderness I had never camped in before. The map showed a network of old logging roads leading deep into the hills, ending in places where few hikers went. I picked a spot about 10 miles from the nearest small town, a clearing by a narrow river bend that I found on satellite view. No campsites, no trails, just woods and water. It looked perfect. The drive got rough after the first hour. The main road turned to cracked pavement, then gravel, then dirt with deep ruts. Pine trees closed in on both sides. Every now and then I'd see signs of an old logging operation, rotting stumps, piles of cut branches half buried in leaves, but mostly it was just thick green forest. My tires crunched over fallen twigs. The sound of my engine felt loud in the stillness. By the time I reached the end of the road, I was at least 6 miles from anything resembling civilization. I pulled over into a small flattened patch of ground, shut off the engine, and let the silence settle in. No cars, no distant hum of traffic, no voices. Just the wind sifting through the trees and the faint rush of water somewhere downhill. I loaded my pack with my tent, sleeping bag, food, stove, and a few tools, then set off on foot toward the sound of the river. It wasn't far, maybe a 20-minute walk, but the undergrowth was thick in some places, forcing me to push through ferns and step over fallen logs slick with moss. The river was narrower than I'd pictured, but it ran clear and cold, twisting between banks littered with rocks and driftwood. There was a small patch of bare earth near a curve in the bank, just big enough for my tent. The ground was firm and dry, and the trees formed a loose wall around 3 sides. It felt sheltered without being claustrophobic. I set my pack down and took a deep breath. The air smelled of wet earth and pine resin. I spent the afternoon setting up camp, driving the tent stakes deep and arranging my gear neatly inside. I gathered a small pile of dry sticks for kindling and kept them under a tarp, though I didn't plan on making a fire until later that night. Once camp was ready, I filled a bottle with river water, filtered it, and sat on a flat rock near the bank just listening. A bird called somewhere high in the canopy. The wind moved in gusts, rattling the branches overhead. Every now and then, a small fish broke the surface of the water. It was peaceful, but there was a strange kind of stillness here too. The kind where you become aware of every small noise because there aren't many of them. Even the river seemed quieter than it should have been. As the sun dipped low, the air cooled fast. I cooked a small meal on my stove and ate sitting cross-legged just outside the tent. The forest shifted in sound as darkness moved in. The birds stopped, and the higher branches creaked in the wind. The smell of damp leaves grew stronger. I didn't light a fire right away, letting my eyes adjust to the dimness while I sat in my jacket, feeling the cold work its way into my sleeves. Eventually, I lit a small fire, no bigger than a backpack, just enough to throw some warmth and light into the clearing. I sat close, feeding it a stick at a time. The flames cracked and hissed when a bit of sap caught. I kept glancing toward the tree line, more out of habit than concern. The shadows there were deep and hard to see through. It was about an hour after dark when I heard it, the sound of something moving in the brush beyond the firelight. Slow steps, heavy enough to break twigs. They came in short bursts, then stopped, then started again. I froze, one hand halfway to the hatchet lying beside my pack. At first I thought it might be a deer, but deer tend to move quickly when startled, bounding away through the woods. This was slower, careful. I leaned forward, listening hard. The sound stopped again. All I could hear was the fire. My skin prickled. The wind had died down completely, leaving the forest unnaturally quiet. After a few minutes, I tossed a stick into the fire and forced myself to keep calm. Could have been anything, a raccoon, maybe even a porcupine. But I didn't like how close it had sounded. I decided to put the fire out earlier than planned. I scattered the embers with a stick and covered them with dirt until the glow vanished. Once it was completely dark, I sat still, letting my hearing adjust to the absence of crackling flames. The forest was just black shapes and faint starlight now. I stayed awake longer than usual, listening. There was nothing, no more footsteps. Eventually I crawled into my tent, zipped the door, and lay in my sleeping bag with my hatchet close to my hand. Sometime in the night, I woke up. First I didn't know why. Then I heard movement again, outside the tent. This time it was closer, leaves crunching, slow and deliberate. My mouth went dry. I held still, trying not to make any noise. The steps came from my left, moved behind the tent, then stopped. I could hear my own pulse in my ears. There was a faint sound like breathing, though it might have been the wind brushing leaves. Then, just as slowly, the steps moved away. I lay awake until dawn. When light finally seeped through the fabric of the tent, I unzipped the door and scanned the clearing. Nothing. No tracks I could see in the packed dirt, though the ground was littered with leaves. I made breakfast, trying to shake the unease. Maybe it really had been a deer or some other harmless animal. Still, I couldn't stop checking the trees. That afternoon, I went exploring upriver, carrying only a small bag with water and a snack. I followed the bank for about 2 miles, moving through stretches where the ground was soft and spongy underfoot. I saw fresh scat near a bend in the river, too big for a deer, and I wasn't sure what animal it belonged to. It made me uneasy. By late afternoon, clouds moved in. The light dimmed, and the forest took on that shadowed, gray tone that always comes before rain. I headed back toward camp, the air thick with the smell of wet earth. When I got back, something was wrong. My pack, which I'd left inside the tent, was now lying outside, about 3 feet from the entrance. The tent door was unzipped. I froze, scanning the trees, every nerve in my body on edge. My mind raced. Had I left it unzipped by mistake? Had an animal gotten inside? I checked the pack. Nothing seemed missing, but there were faint marks on the fabric, like it had been dragged. The rest of the evening I couldn't relax. I kept the fire going, sitting with my back to a tree so nothing could approach from behind without me noticing. The woods felt different now. Every sound seemed sharper, closer. When night fell, I decided I wasn't sleeping. Not fully anyway. I kept the fire low, conserving wood, and stayed wrapped in my jacket, listening. Hours passed. Sometime after midnight, I heard it again. Steps, slow and deliberate, just beyond the firelight. This time I could see movement, a dark shape between the trees. I couldn't make out what it was. It moved sideways, keeping just far enough away to be hidden in shadow. My breath came fast and shallow. I gripped the hatchet tighter. The shape stopped, then moved again. It circled partway around the clearing, always staying just out of the light. My heart hammered in my chest. After what felt like an eternity, the shape melted back into the darkness. I didn't sleep at all that night. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I packed quickly, stuffing everything into my bag without care. The forest felt heavier somehow, as if it was holding its breath. The walk back to the car was tense. I kept glancing over my shoulder, certain I'd see movement, but the woods stayed still. When I reached the dirt road and saw my vehicle, relief washed over me. I tossed my gear in the back and started the engine, the sound startlingly loud after days of quiet. I didn't look in the mirror until I was miles away. When I finally did, the sight made my stomach drop. Muddy prints on the back window. Not animal prints. Fingers. It was late September when I decided to take a solo camping trip deep into the national forest. The tourist season was long over, and the air already had that dry, cool smell of fall. I had taken a few solo trips before, but never this far away from the trails. This time, I wanted complete quiet. No other campers, no distant sound of cars on a highway, no light from towns glowing over the treeline. I had my pack loaded with the usual: a small tent, sleeping bag, some food, a water filter, extra clothes, and my old fixed-blade knife that had been with me for years. I also had a can of bear spray clipped to my chest strap. not because I'd ever had to use it, but because it's the kind of thing you're glad to have when you need it. The hike to the spot I had in mind took most of the afternoon. I followed a narrow trail for about 5 miles, then cut off into the brush, pushing through thickets of dry branches and weaving around clusters of spruce. The deeper I went, the softer the ground became, covered in a thick carpet of moss and fallen pine needles that muffled my steps. By the time I found a small clearing near a slow, shallow stream, the sun was already slanting low. I set up camp quickly, using the last of the light to pitch my tent and stack my firewood. The place felt perfect, the stream for water, the trees forming a windbreak, the clearing big enough for a safe fire. As dusk fell, the temperature dropped fast. I built a small fire, cooked a simple meal, and sat there listening to the forest breathing. At night, the forest feels alive in a different way. Every creak of a branch, every rustle of leaves sounds sharper. I wasn't new to that. I knew most of it was just the usual. Small animals moving through the underbrush, branches shifting as the air cooled. I got into my tent after putting the fire out, lying in the sleeping bag with my headlamp off, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness. I woke once in the middle of the night to a faint sound, like something moving slowly in the brush. It wasn't close, just faint and steady. I stayed still, listening. After a while, it faded, probably a deer. The air was cold, and I fell back asleep. The next morning, mist hung over the stream and my breath came out in clouds. I boiled water for coffee and oatmeal, then spent the morning walking along the stream, looking for animal tracks. I found some deer prints, a set of raccoon tracks near the water, and what might have been coyote prints, but they were old. By afternoon, I'd wandered a few miles from camp, marking my route with small breaks in the brush so I could find my way back. The woods were quiet, almost too quiet at times. Once, I thought I heard something behind me, but when I turned there was nothing. Just trees, their trunks dark with moisture. That second night, the wind picked up. The tent fabric shifted and snapped softly in the breeze, and the trees creaked above me. I was drifting toward sleep when I heard it again. Movement in the brush. This time it was closer, just beyond the clearing. The sound came in short bursts, like something taking a few steps, stopping, then moving again. My pulse quickened, and I slid my hand to the can of bear spray by the tent flap. The sound circled partway around the clearing, then stopped. I lay there, heart pounding, straining to hear. Minutes passed. Finally, I heard slow steps moving away until they faded completely. I told myself it could have been anything, maybe a deer passing through, but I didn't fall asleep for a long time. The third day, I decided to keep my camp in sight for most of the afternoon. I gathered more firewood, filtered water from the stream, and kept an eye on the tree-line. Around mid-afternoon, I found something I hadn't noticed before. A tree at the edge of the clearing with bark peeled away in long strips, the wood underneath scratched deep. The marks were vertical, too high for a small animal. Bear, maybe, or something else. I stared at it for a while before walking back to the fire pit. That night was colder. I kept the fire going longer, feeding it with thick logs. The light didn't reach far into the woods, and beyond it was only darkness. I kept thinking about the peeling bark and the sounds from the night before. Every time the wind shifted, I thought I heard faint steps in the leaves. At some point, maybe around midnight, I woke to the sound of something heavy moving just outside the tent. Not quick, nervous steps like a deer, slow, deliberate. I held my breath, listening. The steps came closer, then stopped right next to my tent. I could hear breathing, low and steady. My skin went cold. I gripped the bear spray, trying not to make any noise. The breathing stayed there for what felt like forever, then moved away toward the trees. I waited a long time before unzipping the tent, just enough to peek out. The fire had burned down to embers. The clearing was empty. The next morning, I saw prints in the soft dirt near my tent. Not paw prints, boot prints. Big ones. I froze, staring at them. They came from the woods, circled the tent, then headed back the way they'd come. I scanned the tree-line, but nothing moved. My mind raced. I was miles from the nearest trail, deep in the forest. Whoever had been here had to know where I was, and they'd been close enough to touch the tent. I packed fast, shoving everything into my pack in a rush. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone step out from the trees. The air felt wrong now, heavy, like the woods were holding their breath. On the hike out, I stayed off my original route, cutting through dense thickets and keeping to uneven ground to make tracking harder. Every sound made me whip my head around, snapping twigs, shifting leaves. More than once, I thought I saw movement far back among the trees, but when I stopped, it vanished. By the time I reached the main trail, the sun was low and my legs ached from pushing so hard. I didn't stop until I was back at my car, throwing my pack in the back seat and locking the doors. Driving away, I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the trees, watching me leave. I never went back to that part of the forest. And even now, years later, I still wonder how long they had been out there watching me, and what would have happened if I hadn't left when I did. The plan was simple. I wanted a weekend away from noise, people, and the constant hum of traffic that seemed to echo in my head, even when I was lying in bed at night. The past few weeks at work had drained me, and I'd been scrolling through maps, looking for some patch of green far enough from a highway to make me feel like I'd actually left civilization behind. I settled on a place I'd only heard about from a coworker, a stretch of public forest a few hours away, with no official campground, no marked trails, just a rough dirt access road that went far enough for you to disappear if you wanted to. I packed light, or at least I told myself I did. The small green tent I'd been using for years, a thick sleeping bag, a foam pad, my old backpack stove, a couple of cheap aluminum pots, a water filter, and enough food for 3 days. I took more water than I thought I'd need. I stuffed a small first aid kit into one of the side pockets of the pack, along with my folding knife and a little flashlight. My phone would be useless there. There was no reception in that part of the state, but I brought it anyway, figuring it could still be used for photos or, in a real emergency, for GPS if I managed to climb high enough to get a signal. The drive was long, and the further I went, the more the road narrowed. Pavement turned into gravel, gravel into dirt. The trees grew closer together, thicker, darker. At one point, I realized I hadn't seen another car in over 40 minutes. The road was so rutted that I had to slow down to a crawl in some stretches, the wheels bouncing in deep muddy grooves from past storms. It felt like the kind of place where you could vanish and no one would know for days. I parked in a small turnout that barely looked like a parking spot. There was no sign, no trail marker, just a faint break in the brush that looked like it could be the start of an old footpath. I shouldered my pack, locked the car, and started walking. The air was cooler under the trees, and the smell of damp leaves and pine needles hung heavy. The forest floor was soft in places, spongy with layers of rotting leaves and moss. I could hear the distant sound of running water, though I couldn't see it yet. My boots sank slightly with each step, and I found myself glancing down often to avoid tripping on hidden roots. The trail wasn't much of a trail at all. It would disappear and reappear, narrowing until I had to push through undergrowth, then widening just enough for me to walk without brushing branches. It twisted downhill for a while, and I followed it until I came to a shallow stream, about knee-deep, moving steadily over a bed of stones. I crossed slowly, stepping from rock to rock, the cold water splashing up against my boots. I went on for another 20 minutes, moving deeper into the woods. At one point, I noticed a large fallen tree with a trunk wide enough to sit on. I stopped there for a moment to catch my breath and drink from my water bottle. The quiet was thick. No distant cars, no human voices, just the faint rustle of wind high in the canopy and the occasional creak of branches. When I found a small clearing ringed with tall pines and thick undergrowth on 3 sides, I decided that would be my campsite. It wasn't perfectly flat, but it was the flattest spot I'd seen in a while. I dropped my pack and began clearing sticks and small stones from the ground. The tent went up easily, though I had to hammer the stakes into soil that was more roots than dirt. I spread my sleeping bag and pad inside, then pulled out my stove and set it up on a flat rock nearby. The rest of the afternoon passed quietly. I boiled water, made instant noodles, and ate slowly, watching the light shift as the sun moved lower. The air cooled, and the shadows between the trees deepened into black. I cleaned my pot, hung my food in a small dry bag from a branch well away from the tent, and sat on a log just listening. There was something almost unnerving about the stillness. No constant buzz of insects like I'd heard in other forests, no steady birdsong. It was as if the place was holding its breath. By the time I crawled into the tent, the light was nearly gone. I turned off my flashlight to save battery and lay there in the dark, listening. The forest had its own sounds, small and scattered. Something scurrying through leaves, the snap of a twig far off, the soft trickle of water from the stream I'd passed earlier. I felt myself drifting. Sometime in the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. The tent was pitch black, and I could hear my own breathing loud in my ears. I thought maybe it was the cold. The temperature had dropped sharply, and the tip of my nose felt numb. I pulled the sleeping bag tighter around me. Then I heard it. It wasn't close, not at first. A slow, steady sound of something moving through the undergrowth. Not the quick, erratic movements of a rabbit or squirrel. This was heavier. Came in short bursts, 3 or 4 steps, a pause, then more steps. My chest tightened. I told myself it was probably a deer. This was their home. I was just a visitor. But I didn't hear the sound of hooves striking the ground. It was softer, almost like padded feet. The steps grew closer. I could make out the faint rustle of leaves being pushed aside, the occasional snap of a stick. The pauses were the worst. The silence would stretch, and I would hold my breath, listening so hard my ears hurt. Then the steps would start again, and I'd realize they were a little closer than before. I reached slowly for my flashlight. My hand shook as I clicked it on, the beam stabbing the inside of the tent in harsh white light. The sound stopped. For a long time, I didn't hear anything. I told myself again it was just a deer, or maybe a fox. The forest was full of animals. I stayed still, listening, until my eyes burned from the effort. When I finally lay back down, I left the flashlight in my hand, just in case. I don't think I slept much after that. The next morning, the forest looked the same, but it felt different. I noticed small things I hadn't before. The way the undergrowth in one spot near my tent was pressed down. The faint marks in the dirt that could have been tracks but were too smudged to tell. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even though I didn't see or hear anything unusual. I decided to stay, but I kept my knife in my pocket for most of the day. I hiked further into the woods, found a small hill with a view of the valley, and sat there for a while eating trail mix. It was beautiful, untouched, the kind of place you imagine when you think of real wilderness. Still, I kept glancing over my shoulder. That night, it came back. This time, the steps didn't start far away. They began close, maybe 20 feet from the tent. Slow, deliberate. A few steps, then stillness. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. My hand gripped the knife handle inside my sleeping bag. The steps circled. Not fast, not loud, but steady. Moving around me. Sometimes I thought they were retreating, only to hear them again on the other side. I thought about unzipping the tent and shining the flashlight out, but something in me resisted. I didn't want to see. It went on for what felt like hours. At some point, I realized I was holding my breath, and I forced myself to breathe slowly, quietly. Eventually, the sound faded into the distance. I lay there until dawn, eyes wide open, waiting for it to return. By morning, I'd made my decision. I packed quickly, barely stopping to eat. The forest no longer felt empty, it felt occupied, and I was the intruder. When I reached the stream, I saw fresh tracks in the mud. Not deer, not human. Large, rounded prints with clear impressions of toes. The kind of track that makes your stomach drop because you know exactly what left it. I didn't stop after that. I pushed hard, barely noticing the weight of my pack, and when I finally saw the dull metal of my car through the trees, I almost ran. I didn't look back until I was on the road, and even then, the trees seemed to close in behind me. I never went camping alone again. It was early September when I decided to go camping alone. The summer heat had started to fade, but the air still carried the smell of warm earth, pine, and dry grass. I had been working too much, stuck indoors under buzzing lights, staring at screens until my eyes hurt. I wanted quiet, real quiet, the kind where you can hear your own heartbeat if you stay still long enough. I picked a spot in a remote part of the state forest, a place I'd seen on a topographic map but never visited. It wasn't an official campsite, no picnic tables or fire rings, just raw land surrounded by hills and thick woods. The drive out there took most of the morning. By the time I left the last paved road, the sky was cloudless, an endless pale blue that made the treeline look sharper. I bumped along a rutted dirt track for miles, my tires crunching over loose gravel and fallen branches. I passed no one. The deeper I went, the more the forest seemed to close in, the trees leaning over the road until they almost touched each other above me. When I finally parked in a small clearing, I killed the engine and sat for a moment in the stillness. The air was warmer than I'd expected, and the only sounds were the ticks and pops of the cooling engine and a faint rustle of leaves high above. I climbed out, stretched, and stood there taking it all in. The ground was uneven, covered in patches of moss and dry pine needles. I could smell sap, faint and sweet, and underneath that, the dusty smell of the earth. I slung my pack over my shoulders and started walking the last half mile to the spot I'd marked on my map. My boots sank slightly into the soft ground where moss grew thick and twigs cracked under my weight. A few squirrels darted across my path, tails flicking as they vanished into the underbrush. The air felt heavier the deeper I went, as though the trees were filtering out not just light, but sound. When I reached the spot, it was better than I'd hoped. A small clearing surrounded by dense fir and spruce, with a shallow creek about 30 yards to the east. The grass in the clearing was short and patchy, and a few flat rocks jutted up from the soil. Sunlight poured in from above, but the edges of the clearing were shadowed, the undergrowth so thick it looked almost like a wall. I dropped my pack, feeling the relief in my shoulders. I set up my small tent near the edge of the clearing, close enough to the trees for shade, but far enough away that nothing was hanging directly over me. The tent went up quickly, the fabric snapping lightly in the faint breeze. After laying out my sleeping bag and stowing my gear, I took my water filter down to the creek. The creek was shallow, the water clear enough to see every pebble on the bottom. The sound of it trickling over the stones was calming, almost hypnotic. I crouched, filled my bottles, and rinsed my hands in the icy flow. The shock of the cold water made my skin tighten. I lingered for a minute, watching tiny insects skate across the surface and listening to the distant tapping of a woodpecker somewhere up the slope. Back at camp, I ate a late lunch, trail mix, jerky, and an apple, then stretched out on the grass, staring up at the sky. The air was still warm, but I could feel a hint of coolness underneath it. Lying there, I started to notice things I'd missed before. A faint game trail leading off through the underbrush. A large, half-rotted log near the treeline, its bark stripped away on one side. The quiet here wasn't complete. There were bird calls, the faint creak of branches, but it was different from the constant background noise of the city. Every sound stood out on its own. As the afternoon wore on, I decided to explore. I followed the game trail for about 100 yards before it split in two directions. To the left, it seemed to wind uphill toward a ridge. To the right, it dropped slightly toward what looked like denser woods. I took the uphill path, my boots slipping slightly on loose soil. At the top, I found a rocky outcrop with a view over the trees. The hills rolled away into the distance, their slopes dark with pines, and far off I could just make out the shimmer of a lake. I stood there for a while, feeling the wind on my face, then headed back down. By the time I returned to camp, the light had started to shift, the shadows stretching longer across the clearing. I gathered some deadfall for a small fire, stacking it neatly beside the fire pit I'd made from a ring of stones. The matches caught quickly, the flames licking up the dry wood, and soon I had a steady fire going. The smell of the smoke drifted through the clearing, mixing with the sharp scent of pine. I cooked a simple meal over the fire, instant noodles with bits of dried vegetables, and ate slowly, listening to the forest around me. The sounds changed as dusk came on. The birds grew quieter, replaced by the steady chirp of crickets and the occasional distant call of something larger. Once, I heard a faint splash from the direction of the creek, but when I glanced that way, the trees hid whatever had made it. When full darkness came, it was total. The moon wasn't up yet, and without the fire, I would have been blind beyond a few feet. I added a couple more pieces of wood to keep the flame steady, but not so much that it would burn too fast. The warmth felt good on my face, but the shadows just beyond the circle of light seemed deeper now, heavier somehow. It was sometime after I'd crawled into my tent, zipped the flap, and settled into my sleeping bag that I first heard it. A faint, deliberate crunch of leaves. Not the quick, light sound of a rabbit or squirrel, but slower, heavier. I froze, every muscle in my body tensed. The sound came again, slightly closer this time. My mind ran through possibilities, deer, maybe an elk, but something about the rhythm was wrong. It didn't pause to sniff the air or break into a run. It just kept moving, steady, unhurried. I told myself it was nothing, that animals moved at night all the time, but I found myself straining to hear more. For a few minutes, there was nothing but the soft rush of the creek and the distant call of an owl. Then another sound came, a faint, irregular scraping, like something brushing against bark. This time it was farther off, but my skin prickled all the same. I lay there for a long time listening. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I drifted into a light, uneasy sleep. The first thing I noticed when I stepped out of my car was how quiet it was. Not the normal kind of quiet you get in the countryside. This was the kind that made you feel like the whole world had paused. No distant highway hum, no bird calls, no wind moving through leaves, just stillness. I stood there for a while, holding the strap of my backpack, letting my eyes adjust to the shade under the tall pine trees. The dirt road I'd driven in on curved away behind me, the loose gravel crunching under my boots when I shifted my weight. My plan was simple: spend a few nights out here alone, away from everything. No phone signal, no noise, no people. Just me, my tent, and the woods. The campsite wasn't an official one. I'd found it marked on an old hiking forum, posted by some guy years ago who swore it was one of the most peaceful spots he'd ever camped in. A small clearing about a mile's walk from where you could park, with a creek nearby and plenty of flat ground. I downloaded the map offline and marked the coordinates. It felt like something private, like a secret I was borrowing for a few days. The trail started narrow, overgrown in places, roots curling across the dirt. The deeper I went, the more the air smelled of damp soil and pine needles. I could hear my own breathing louder than anything else, steady and deep under the weight of my pack. Every now and then I'd hear a twig snap somewhere in the brush, but it was just the kind of random noise you get in the woods. A squirrel, a branch settling, nothing more. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was starting to drop behind the trees. It was exactly like the guy had described. A small open space surrounded by tall pines, with a shallow creek about 30 yards away, its water dark and slow in the fading light. I set my pack down, stretched my shoulders, and started unpacking my gear. The ground was firm and mostly flat, though a few roots pushed up under the dirt here and there. I stomped out a spot and pitched my tent, double-checking the stakes. I laid out my sleeping bag, unrolled my foam mat, and stacked my cooking gear near the fire pit. A ring of blackened rocks that looked like it hadn't been used in a long time. Dinner was quick. A freeze-dried meal I'd boiled water for on my small stove. I ate sitting on a log, watching the last light fade out of the sky. The air cooled fast, and soon my breath was visible when I exhaled. The forest seemed to grow thicker as the darkness settled, the shapes of the trees blending into one another until they were just black pillars against the night. My headlamp beam caught floating specks of dust and the faint glint of spiderwebs between branches. When I crawled into my tent that night, it was silent again. I could hear the blood rushing in my ears when I lay still. Out here, every small sound was amplified. The faint rustle of leaves, the drip of water somewhere in the creek, the occasional knock of wood when a branch shifted. I told myself I liked that. That's why I came here, to be reminded of what real quiet feels like. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. My tent was black inside, the air cold enough that I pulled the sleeping bag tighter around my shoulders. At first, I didn't know why I was awake, but then I heard it. A slow, deliberate crunch of leaves. Not close, but not far either. Maybe 50, 60 yards away. Then another. Then nothing. My body stayed tense, ears straining for the next sound. It didn't come. After a while, I convinced myself it was just a deer and drifted back to sleep. The second day was uneventful at first. I made coffee by the fire pit and sat with it warming my hands. I followed the creek upstream for a while, looking for a good place to refill my water bottles. The sun was bright through the trees, but the light never seemed to reach the forest floor completely. Everything felt damp, even the air. I saw no other people, no signs of anyone having been here in a long time. The only tracks near the water were animal. Deer, raccoon, maybe a coyote. That afternoon, I gathered more firewood, breaking branches over my knee and stacking them by the pit. I made another meal, read for a while in my tent, and watched the shadows grow long again. When night came, I was ready for it. I zipped up my tent, crawled inside, and lay still listening. It was a little after midnight when I heard it again. The same crunch of leaves, the same slow spacing between steps. Only this time, it sounded closer. I lay frozen, heart thumping in my chest. The sound moved, pausing for a few seconds, then starting again. Whatever it was, it circled the clearing. I could tell by the way the sound shifted from one side of the tent to the other. My mouth was dry. I reached slowly for the handle of my knife, not unzipping it from its sheath, just holding it. Minutes passed. The sound faded. Nothing touched the tent. Nothing spoke. Nothing ran away. Eventually, I heard only the creak again. I didn't sleep much after that. By the third day, my nerves were raw. I kept scanning the trees as I moved around the clearing. Every flicker of movement in the brush made my stomach clench. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a bear, maybe even just a curious deer that had never smelled a person here before. But there was something about the way it moved at night that didn't feel like an animal. Too slow, too deliberate. That afternoon, I found something I couldn't explain. About 50 yards from camp, just off the trail I'd hiked in on, was a single footprint in the soft dirt. Not a boot print. It was bare, with toes clearly visible, the heel sunk deeper like someone had been putting weight on it. The size looked close to mine. I crouched there staring at it for a long time, my skin crawling. I hadn't walked here barefoot. No one should be here. I went back to camp, built my fire higher, and sat close to it until long after dark. My flashlight stayed in my hand even when I was eating. Every sound in the woods seemed to come from just beyond the circle of light. When I finally climbed into my tent, I left the knife beside me and the light on. I lay there watching the shadows move across the fabric as the fire outside burned lower. It must have been around 2 a.m. when I woke again, and this time there was no mistaking it. The sound was close. Too close. Soft, slow steps on the dirt right outside the tent. I could hear the faint shift of weight, the scrape of something against a rock. My chest felt tight. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to be quiet, but they weren't in a hurry either. They were just moving. The steps circled me. Once, twice. Then they stopped at the back of the tent. I could hear my own breathing, fast and shallow. My hand was tight on the knife handle. Then came the sound of something brushing the fabric. Just the lightest touch, dragging slowly down the side. My body went cold. I thought about yelling, about charging out, but I stayed still, every muscle locked. After a long time, I don't know how long, the steps started again, moving away into the woods. I lay there until dawn, eyes wide open, waiting for the light. By the time the sun came up, I'd made up my mind. I packed my gear fast, barely stopping to eat. My hands shook as I rolled the tent, stuffing it into my pack. The clearing felt different now. Not peaceful, not quiet, just wrong. The hike back to the car was quick, but I kept glancing over my shoulder. At one point, I thought I heard steps behind me, but when I stopped, there was nothing. When I reached the dirt road, I almost ran the last stretch. The car was exactly where I'd left it, but my gut didn't unclench until I was inside with the doors locked. I drove without looking back, my hands gripping the wheel. Even now, I keep thinking about that footprint, about the way whoever it was moved at night. Not running, not rushing, just walking, slow and steady, around and around my tent. And the worst part is knowing that if they wanted to come in, nothing was stopping them. I had planned this camping trip for months. It wasn't anything too fancy, just a simple weekend away from work, away from the noise, away from people. I picked a quiet stretch of woods about 2 hours from where I lived. It wasn't an official campground with paved spots and showers. It was the kind of place where the trail narrowed down to nothing and you had to make your own site. That's exactly what I wanted. No other campers nearby, no kids yelling, no lights at night except the stars. I packed light but careful. Small tent, sleeping bag, food sealed in plastic containers, water filter, first aid kit, flashlight, batteries, and my old hunting knife. I had a small propane stove too. I left my phone in the car except for emergencies because I didn't want to sit there scrolling when I could be listening to the wind in the trees. I got to the trailhead late in the afternoon, parked where the dirt lot ended, slung my pack on my shoulders and started walking. The trail was narrow, the kind that made you brush branches every few steps. In places, roots stuck up like knotted ropes, and I had to watch my footing. The air smelled like pine and damp leaves. It was early autumn, so the ground was littered with dry brown leaves that crunched under my boots. The sky was pale blue with a few streaky clouds, but the sun was already dipping toward the ridge in the west. I knew I'd have maybe 2 hours before the light really started to fade. I walked about 40 minutes before finding the right spot, a small clearing just off a shallow stream. The trees made a loose circle around it, tall pines mixed with oaks and maples, and the stream's sound was a low, constant trickle. There were no signs of recent campfires or trash, which meant it probably hadn't been used in a long time. Perfect. I set my pack down, stretched my shoulders, and started clearing a flat space for the tent. The ground was soft, easy to drive stakes into, and I had the tent up in less than 10 minutes. I laid my sleeping bag inside, set my food on a flat rock a little ways from the tent, and put my stove and water filter nearby. Before it got too dark, I gathered some fallen branches for a small campfire. Nothing big, just enough to boil water and keep warm. I made sure to clear a safe circle of dirt so I wouldn't risk setting anything else on fire. When the fire was going, I boiled some water and poured it over a bag of dehydrated stew. The smell made my stomach growl. I sat on a log, holding the steaming pouch in my hands, and ate slowly. The woods had grown darker while I cooked. The sun was gone now, and only the faintest orange glow hung low in the sky. The air was cooling fast, and I could see my breath in the firelight. The sounds of the woods had shifted too. The chirping birds were quiet now. I heard the occasional rustle in the leaves, probably small animals. An owl called somewhere far off. The fire cracked and popped, sending sparks upward. When I'd eaten, I sealed the trash in a bag and stored it with the rest of my food on the rock. I poured water on the fire until the last ember hissed out. Then I sat for a while, letting my eyes adjust to the dark. Above me, through the tops of the trees, the stars were already sharp and bright. Eventually, I crawled into the tent, zipped the door, and lay back in my sleeping bag. The ground was cool but not cold, and the sound of the stream was steady, like white noise. I drifted in and out of light sleep. Somewhere deep in the night, a sound woke me. At first, I thought it was just a branch falling, a sudden crack and thump, but then I heard another noise softer, like something moving through the leaves. My first thought was a deer. I stayed still, listening. The movement wasn't heavy enough to be a bear, but it wasn't the fast scurry of a raccoon either. It was slow, careful. I held my breath. Whatever it was circling, not just passing through. I could hear it on one side of the tent, then silence, then a faint sound on the other side. I reached quietly for my flashlight and knife, keeping them beside me. I didn't unzip the tent. If it was a deer or some other harmless animal, I'd scare it off when I moved. But the sound kept stopping and starting, like it was pausing to listen. Minutes passed, Then I heard the faint clink of something metal against metal. My food containers. My stomach tightened. I'd sealed them well, but animals can be persistent. I sat up slowly, debating whether to open the tent and chase it off. But then the sound stopped again. No movement, nothing but the stream. I waited what felt like forever before laying back down. Eventually, sleep returned, though it was light and restless. In the morning, I unzipped the tent and stepped out. The air was cold, and a thin mist hung over the stream. My food containers were still on the rock, but one had been moved a few inches. There were no claw marks, no teeth marks, just the position changed. That made me uneasy. If it had been an animal, I expected some kind of mess or damage. I boiled water for coffee and tried to shake it off. Maybe I'd nudged it last night without noticing. I spent the morning hiking along the stream, following it north where it widened into a shallow pool. There were tracks in the mud, deer for sure, and maybe raccoon, but nothing unusual. By noon, I was back at camp, eating a small lunch of crackers and jerky. The rest of the day was calm. I gathered more wood, kept the fire small, and watched the sun drop through the trees. I planned to stay one more night before heading back in the morning. That evening, as the fire burned low, I heard movement again. This time it was further out, maybe 30 yards away, faint but steady, came from the same direction as last night. I tightened my grip on my flashlight and kept my knife close. The sound stopped when I moved, and the woods fell silent. I put the fire out and sat in the dark, letting my ears adjust. The night felt different, heavier somehow. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. The movement started again, a slow crunch through the leaves. This time I stood and shined my flashlight toward the sound. The beam caught nothing but tree trunks and branches. But I saw, just for a second, the faint sway of a low branch, as if something had passed beneath it. My skin crawled. I stayed up late that night listening. Around midnight, the sound faded away, and I finally crawled into my tent. I kept the flashlight in my hand and the knife by my side. My sleep was shallow, filled with half-dreams of movement outside. When morning came, I found something that made my stomach drop. Near the edge of camp, where the ground was soft, there were footprints. Not boots, not animal tracks, bare human footprints. They led from the trees to just behind my tent and back into the woods. The size looked adult, maybe a man's. I packed fast. My heart was hammering. Every time a branch cracked, I whipped my head toward it. I didn't even bother with breakfast, just stuffed my gear into the pack, made sure nothing was left, and started back toward the car. The walk felt longer than it had coming in. Every noise made me glance over my shoulder. I kept thinking about those footprints, how close they had come to me while I slept. When I finally saw the dirt lot, I felt a wave of relief. My car was right where I left it. I threw the pack inside, got in, and locked the doors. I sat there for a long moment, gripping the wheel, looking at the trailhead. The woods were still and quiet. I started the engine and drove away, not looking back. I don't know who it was out there or what they wanted, but I know this: they had been there the first night, circling. They'd been there the second night, closer. And they had stood right behind my tent while I was asleep. I haven't camped alone since. It had been weeks since I'd been out of the city, and my head felt like it was stuffed with static. The kind that makes it hard to think straight, the kind that builds after too many days under fluorescent lights, too many nights with the low hum of traffic outside the window. I wanted quiet, not the fake kind you get in a park where you can still hear sirens and car doors slamming, but real quiet. The kind that comes when you're far from anything man-made, where the only sounds are wind through trees, birds, and maybe the occasional snap of a branch. I'd done plenty of camping before, though usually with friends. This time I wanted to go alone. I'd been looking at maps for a few days and finally settled on a place that wasn't exactly a marked campground, more like an unmaintained stretch of forest a few hours away. It was a mixture of pine and hardwood, crossed by a shallow river, and from what I could tell on satellite images, there were no real trails cutting through it. That was the appeal. I wanted to walk until there was no one else. I left early in the morning with my pack already set. Tent, sleeping bag, some dehydrated meals, stove, water filter, headlamp, extra clothes. The weather forecast was decent, no rain, just cool nights and mild days. Perfect conditions. The drive was uneventful, though the last stretch was down a cracked and narrow road that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. It dead-ended at a gravel patch that could fit maybe 3 cars. Only one other vehicle was there, an old rust-colored pickup with mud up the sides. No one in sight. I locked my car, adjusted my pack, and started walking. The first stretch was easy, a faded path that followed the river downstream. The water was low enough that it revealed big stones scattered like stepping points across the shallows. I could hear it moving over the rocks, a soft and constant sound. The further I went, the more the signs of people vanished. After an hour, the path had almost disappeared entirely, replaced by deer tracks and narrow openings between thick growth. I pushed through, using a trekking pole to move aside low branches and keep my balance on uneven ground. By midday, I'd gone far enough that I couldn't hear anything but nature. No hum of distant roads, no planes overhead, just the creak of trees and the occasional rustle in the underbrush. I found a spot near the river where the ground was relatively flat and clear of big roots. There were enough tall pines to break the wind, and I could see an open patch of sky above where the sun came through in long, sharp beams. I set my pack down and took my time pitching the tent, making sure the stakes were solid in the soil. After eating a quick lunch, just a pack of jerky and some trail mix, I wandered along the river for a while. It twisted and curved through the forest, sometimes narrowing to just a few feet across, other times widening into still, dark pools. I noticed animal tracks in the mud, mostly deer, raccoon, maybe some fox. Nothing unusual. The air smelled clean, a mix of pine sap and damp earth. I felt good. I felt like I'd found exactly what I'd been looking for. As the afternoon cooled, I returned to camp and started boiling water for dinner. The light through the trees had turned gold, and I figured I'd eat, then walk a little before it got dark. That's when I noticed something small but odd. A tree about 20 feet from my tent had fresh cuts in the bark, deep vertical scratches maybe 3 or 4 inches long. They were too high up for a small animal and didn't look like anything a human would do. I told myself it was probably from a bear or maybe a big cat passing through. This was their home after all. I made a mental note to hang my food bag far from camp that night. After eating, I walked upriver for maybe half a mile just exploring. The water was louder there, tumbling over a series of small falls. I stood listening for a while, then turned back as the light began to fade. In the distance, somewhere deeper in the trees, I heard what sounded like a branch breaking. Not the soft snap of a twig, but the sharp, heavy crack of something thick. I froze and listened. A moment later, there was nothing but the rush of water again. I told myself it was probably a deer moving through and kept going. Back at camp, I hung my food bag from a branch at least 12 feet up and a good 100 feet from my tent. The forest was darker now, the light draining fast. I crawled into my tent, read for a while by headlamp, then switched it off. For a while, I just lay there listening to the sounds outside. It was calm. A little wind, the river, occasional small rustles in the underbrush. I must have drifted off sometime around 10. I woke to a sound that didn't fit. It was faint at first, somewhere in the edge of my awareness. A slow, steady crunch of leaves, spaced apart like footsteps. My eyes opened and I lay still, trying to judge the distance. It wasn't right outside the tent, but it wasn't far either. Maybe 30 or 40 feet away. The steps would come, then stop, then come again. I reached slowly for the handle of my knife, keeping my breathing quiet. After a minute, the sound stopped completely. I stayed awake for a long time, waiting for it to start again, but it didn't. Eventually, I dozed off, though it was a light and restless sleep. In the morning, I stepped out and scanned the area. Nothing seemed disturbed. The food bag was still where I'd left it, untouched. I walked toward the direction I'd heard the steps the night before. The ground, there was a mix of pine needles and patches of mud. In one of those patches, I saw a print. Not a clear one, but enough to tell it was from something large, wider than my hand, with deep impressions at the front where claws had sunk in. My stomach tightened. I didn't know enough to tell exactly what it was, but my first thought was bear. I debated packing up and heading back, but I'd come for quiet and I wasn't ready to turn around yet. Instead, I decided to be more careful. I kept my bear spray on my hip and stayed closer to camp when I wandered. The day passed quietly enough, though I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every snap of a branch made me look over my shoulder. That night, I built a small fire before bed, thinking maybe the light and smell would keep animals away. I sat by it until the wood burned down to coals, then doused it and crawled into my tent. I must have fallen asleep faster than I expected, because the next thing I knew, I was awake again, heart pounding, with the sound of something breathing just outside the tent wall. It was slow and heavy, not the quick sniffing of a raccoon or fox. I could hear the shift of weight on the ground, the faint creak of the tent fabric when whatever it was brushed against it. My mouth was dry. I didn't move. The breathing went on for what felt like forever. Then there was a low sound, not quite a growl, more like a deep exhale. Then the footsteps again, moving away. When morning came, I unzipped the tent slowly and stepped out. The ground just a few feet away had fresh prints, much clearer this time. Big, rounded paw shapes with deep claw marks. Definitely bear. My first thought was to leave right then, but I was miles from the trailhead and I wasn't sure if the bear was still nearby. If I ran into it on the narrow deer paths, I'd have no room to move. I packed quickly, keeping my eyes on the trees. The forest felt different now, heavier somehow, like it was holding its breath. I started walking back along the river, moving steadily but not too fast. Every so often, I'd stop to listen. Once, I thought I heard movement behind me, but when I turned, there was nothing. By midday, I was exhausted. The trail, if you could call it that, was harder to follow going back, and I realized I'd strayed closer to the riverbank than before. I was just about to correct my course when I saw movement ahead. A large, dark shape between the trees, maybe 50 yards away. It was facing me, head low, shoulders humped. Even from that distance, I could see the shine of its fur. I froze. The bear didn't move, just watched me. I slowly reached for the bear spray, keeping it ready. My heart felt like it was pounding in my throat. After what felt like a full minute, the bear shifted its head, turned slightly, and walked off into the trees. I didn't waste a second. I kept moving, faster now, trying to put as much distance between us as possible. The rest of the hike back was a blur of nerves and constant scanning. When I finally saw the gravel patch through the trees, I felt like I could breathe again. My car was still there, and I didn't see the old pickup anywhere. I threw my pack in the back, got in, and locked the doors before starting the engine. Driving away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the bear on the road behind me. Of course, there was nothing. Still, the image of it standing there in the trees stayed with me. The size, the stillness, the quiet way it watched me. Out there, I'd been on its ground, and it had let me leave. That thought settled in heavy. When I got home that night, the quiet I'd wanted so badly didn't feel the same anymore. It was mid-September when I decided to spend a few days alone in the woods. The idea had been sitting in my head for months. I wanted a quiet break from the noise of town, the constant ringing of phones, and the endless flow of people. I'd been camping before, but always with friends or family. This time, I wanted to see how I'd do alone. Just me, a tent, and whatever the woods had to offer. I told myself it would be peaceful, maybe even refreshing. I packed carefully. A sturdy tent, sleeping bag, small gas stove, basic cooking tools, canned food, protein bars, a hatchet, a folding knife, a first aid kit, and extra clothes. I also brought a good flashlight, spare batteries, a whistle, and a cheap but functional compass. My backpack was heavy, but I didn't mind. I'd chosen a spot in a national forest about 4 hours away, a place where camping was allowed but not crowded. I wanted space, not neighbors in tents 20 feet away. The drive there was quiet. The road wound through farmland, then into low hills where the trees thickened. The further I went, the less I saw of houses or even passing cars. By the time I reached the forest entrance, it felt like I'd already left the rest of the world behind. The parking area was small, with only 2 other vehicles. I checked the posted map, chose a trail that led deep into the woods, and shouldered my pack. The air was cool, the sky pale blue with a few slow-moving clouds. The trail started out wide and easy, but within half an hour, it narrowed, bending through tall pines and patches of thick undergrowth. Dry leaves crunched under my boots. Somewhere far off, I heard water, maybe a stream or river. After about an hour and a half of walking, I reached a flat clearing surrounded by trees. The ground was mostly dry dirt with patches of grass, and there was just enough open space to set up camp. From one side of the clearing, I could see the forest floor dropping sharply toward a rocky creek. I decided it was perfect. I set my pack down and took a moment to catch my breath, then started unpacking. The tent went up first. I chose a spot where the dirt was level but slightly higher than the rest, just in case it rained. I staked it down tightly, tested the zippers, and spread my sleeping bag inside. After that, I gathered some small sticks and branches from the ground. I wasn't planning to make a huge fire, just enough to boil water and warm the air a little after dark. By the time I finished setting everything up, it was mid-afternoon. The forest had a different sound this far in, quieter, but not silent. Every so often, there'd be a bird call, the rustle of leaves, or the distant crack of a branch. I walked down toward the creek to fill my bottle. The water was cold and clear, moving fast over rocks. I crouched there for a while, just listening. Being alone in the woods had a strange weight to it. Every sound seemed louder, every movement sharper. I felt calm, but also very aware of how far I was from anyone else. Back at camp, I boiled water for coffee and ate a protein bar. The sun was dipping lower now, shadows stretching out from the trees. I checked my surroundings again, part habit, part instinct, then lit a small fire. The warmth felt good as the temperature dropped. I sat on a flat rock and let the quiet sink in. My phone had no signal, which was exactly what I wanted. After dark, the forest became a different place. The trees loomed black against the faint glow of the sky. I kept my flashlight nearby but didn't use it much, trying to let my eyes adjust. The fire crackled softly, sending up sparks. Somewhere beyond the edge of the clearing, I heard movement, a faint, irregular rustle in the dry leaves. It wasn't close, maybe 50 yards out, but I still felt my chest tighten. I told myself it was probably a deer, maybe a raccoon. I listened until the sound faded, then stirred the fire. That first night, I slept in short stretches. I'd drift off, then wake to the faint sounds outside. A branch snapping, leaves shifting, water moving over the creek bed. Every time I woke, I listened hard, trying to decide if what I'd heard was natural. Most of it was. The forest is alive at night. Still, being alone made me extra alert. Around 3 in the morning, I woke again. This time, there was a different sound, slow, deliberate steps in the leaves. My pulse kicked up. The steps were not close, but they were steady, heading in the general direction of my camp. I stayed still, barely breathing, hand on the flashlight. The sound paused, then started again, moving past the clearing. I didn't move until I could no longer hear it. I told myself it was just an animal, but the rhythm had seemed careful. When morning came, I felt the lack of sleep. I brewed coffee, forced down a quick breakfast, and decided to explore further upstream along the creek. The woods here were dense, with fallen trees and thorny undergrowth forcing me to pick my way carefully. The creek curved through a narrow section between 2 ridges. The air smelled of damp earth and pine. I found a small open spot where the water pooled deep enough for fishing, though I hadn't brought gear. I sat there for a while, letting the sun warm my face, but I couldn't shake the memory of those footsteps in the night. I kept scanning the trees. Nothing moved except for the occasional bird. By early afternoon, I headed back. The fire pit from the night before still held a bit of ash, undisturbed. My tent looked fine. I made lunch, then gathered more wood for the evening. The day passed quietly. Late in the afternoon, I noticed something odd. A faint path leading away from the clearing, almost hidden under leaves. It was narrow, not like an official trail, but worn enough that it had been used more than once. I followed it a short distance, maybe 30 yards, until it ended abruptly at a fallen tree. There was nothing there, just the trunk and moss. I went back to camp, but the image of that path stayed in my head. That night, the wind picked up, making the tent walls tremble slightly. I built the fire higher, both for warmth and comfort. The woods sounded busier than the night before, branches creaking, leaves swirling. I tried to read a small paperback I'd brought, but kept glancing up at the dark tree line. Around midnight, I heard something again. Not footsteps this time, but the faint scrape of something brushing against bark. Then, after a pause, a single sharp crack, like a stick snapping under weight. I turned off my small camp lantern so I could see past the glow. My eyes adjusted slowly, and for a while I saw nothing unusual. Eventually, the sounds faded. I stayed up longer than I planned, letting the fire die to glowing coals before finally getting into the tent. The third day started overcast. A thin mist hung over the trees, dampening the air. I boiled water for oatmeal, then decided to hike further out, carrying only a small day pack. The forest felt different in the mist, muffled, like everything was wrapped in cloth. I followed the main trail for a while, then cut off toward higher ground. The climb was steep, but from the top, I could see over the canopy, rolling green stretching for miles. No sign of people anywhere. On the way back, I thought about packing up a day early, but the idea felt like quitting. I told myself I was just being jumpy. Plenty of solo campers spend nights in the woods without trouble. When I reached camp in the late afternoon, something was wrong. My tent was still there, but one of the side flaps was unzipped halfway. I was sure I'd closed it fully before leaving. Inside, my sleeping bag had shifted, like it had been moved. Nothing was missing, at least not that I could see, but the sight made my stomach tighten. I checked the ground outside. In the damp dirt, I found a faint mark, not a full footprint, but a partial impression, too narrow to be from my boots. I told myself it could have been an animal nosing around, maybe brushing against the tent fabric. Still, I kept scanning the trees as I rebuilt the fire that evening. Night came again, and with it, the same sense of being watched. I ate quickly, cleaned my cookware, and kept my flashlight close. The forest was utterly black beyond the fire's reach. At some point, I heard it again, the slow, steady crunch of leaves, closer than before. My chest tightened. The sound stopped, then started again from a different direction, like whoever or whatever it was had circled partway around me. I stayed by the fire, gripping the hatchet, until the sound faded. I barely slept that night, lying in the dark with every muscle tense, listening. At first light, I decided I was done. The trip wasn't worth the unease anymore. I packed quickly, checking over my shoulder every few minutes. The forest seemed too quiet now, no birds, no rustle of squirrels. As I started down the trail, I caught movement far back in the trees, a tall human shape, just for a second before it slipped behind a trunk. My stomach dropped. I didn't stop to confirm it. I tightened my straps and kept walking, faster than before, not running but close to it. Every bend in the trail made me glance back. I saw nothing else. It was early autumn when I decided to take a few days off from work and spend some time alone in the woods. I had been feeling burnt out, and the quiet of nature seemed like the best way to reset. The plan was simple: drive out to a remote camping area, set up my tent by a small lake, hike during the day, and relax by a fire at night. I had camped before, so I knew what I needed. My gear was packed neatly in the back of my truck: a sturdy two-person tent, sleeping bag, cooking supplies, a small cooler, a water filter, a flashlight, and a hunting knife. I even brought along extra rope and a tarp in case of bad weather. The location I had chosen was far from any town, about a 2-hour drive past the last gas station. The last stretch of the road was just a rough dirt track that wound through tall pines and patches of maple and birch. The leaves had already started to turn, deep reds and golden yellows flashing between the evergreens. It was beautiful, but it also had that stillness you feel in places far away from people. The air was crisp when I stepped out of the truck, carrying my pack to a spot I had marked on a topographic map days earlier. The lake was smaller than I expected, more like a wide pond, with dark, still water and reeds along the edges. The ground was soft with pine needles, and the trees formed a thick wall around the clearing. I liked how secluded it felt. The only sound was the faint rustle of wind through the branches and the occasional ripple in the water. I chose a flat patch of ground near the shore to set up my tent. By the time camp was ready, the sun had started to dip lower, staining the treetops with orange light. I made a simple meal on my small camp stove, then sat on a log, eating slowly and watching the sky darken. A few insects buzzed around, but it was otherwise quiet, almost too quiet. I told myself it was just the lack of background noise from the city making it seem strange. That first night, I slept well enough. The air was cold, but my sleeping bag kept me warm. I woke a few times to the sound of water lapping softly at the shore, but nothing out of the ordinary. In the morning, I boiled water for coffee and oatmeal, then went for a long hike through the forest. The trails here were barely marked, and in some areas I had to navigate by compass. I enjoyed the solitude. Hours passed before I saw anything move, just a squirrel darting through the underbrush. By late afternoon, I returned to camp tired but satisfied. I refilled my water from the lake, filtering it carefully, then started gathering wood for a fire. The ground was damp in places, so it took a while to find enough dry branches. As I worked, I noticed something odd near the tree-line. A patch of disturbed earth, like something had been dug up. It wasn't large, maybe a few feet across, and the dirt looked freshly turned. There were no shovel marks, just loose soil and some scattered pine needles. I crouched down, running my hand over it. Could have been from an animal digging for roots or burying food. Still, it didn't look quite right. The hole wasn't deep, more like the top layer of earth had been scraped away. I decided it wasn't worth worrying about and went back to building my fire. That night, as the fire crackled and sent sparks into the dark, I felt more on edge than I had the night before. The trees seemed closer somehow, their black silhouettes pressing in around the small circle of light. I ate my dinner in silence, listening to the occasional splash in the water. There were no loons calling, no frogs croaking, no crickets chirping. It was as if the forest was holding its breath. When I finally put out the fire and crawled into the tent, I zipped the door tight and lay still, waiting for sleep. For a long time, I couldn't hear anything but my own breathing. Then, sometime deep in the night, I heard it, faint but distinct, the crunch of footsteps on dry leaves. They were slow and deliberate, moving somewhere just beyond the tent. I froze, my eyes wide in the dark. Could have been a deer, I told myself, maybe even a raccoon. But the steps didn't sound like an animal. They were too heavy, too evenly spaced. They moved in a slow arc, circling the tent. I lay there, gripping the knife I kept by my side. The steps stopped for several minutes. I almost convinced myself I had imagined it, until I heard the sound again, this time behind me. A stick snapped, sharp in the stillness. I held my breath, every muscle tense. Then, nothing. No retreat, no more movement, just silence. I don't know how long I stayed awake, staring at the dark fabric above me, but eventually exhaustion pulled me under. In the morning, I unzipped the tent and stepped out, scanning the clearing. Nothing looked out of place, but when I walked toward the tree-line, I saw them, faint impressions in the dirt. They were footprints. Not boot prints exactly, but bare feet, wider and flatter than normal, with deep impressions from the heel. The tracks weren't fresh enough to show perfect detail, but they were clear enough to see the shape. They came from the woods, circled the tent area, and disappeared back into the trees. I told myself someone could have been hiking through the area, maybe camping nearby, though I hadn't seen any other campsites for miles. Still, the idea of someone wandering around my tent in the middle of the night was unsettling. I spent most of the day closer to camp, gathering more wood and keeping the fire going. The smoke made me feel safer somehow, as if it marked my space. That night, I kept the fire burning longer, feeding it with thick logs until the flames cast long shadows into the woods. I sat close, listening to the pop and hiss of the burning wood. Hours passed without incident, and I started to think maybe whoever it was had moved on. I put the fire out around midnight and went into the tent. This time, I didn't fall asleep quickly. Every small sound made me tense. Around what must have been 2 in the morning, I heard it again, the slow, steady crunch of footsteps. They came from the same direction as before, moving carefully, as if trying not to be heard. The steps stopped a short distance from the tent. Then I heard a different sound, a slow, dragging scrape, like something heavy being pulled across the ground. It moved for several feet, then stopped. I gripped the knife tighter, my pulse hammering in my ears. The sounds didn't come closer, but they didn't go away either. Whoever or whatever it was seemed to be standing just out of sight, watching. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps began again, moving away into the trees. I waited for the silence to stretch long enough to feel safe, then unzipped the tent as quietly as I could. The clearing was dimly lit by moonlight. I saw no one, but the ground near the tree-line looked disturbed again. I forced myself not to go closer. By morning, I had made my decision. I was leaving. I packed my gear quickly, glancing over my shoulder every few minutes. The disturbed patch near the trees was still there, and next to it was something new. A long, narrow trench dug into the soil, maybe 3 feet long and less than a foot wide. I didn't stop to study it. The idea of being caught alone out there with someone who had been circling my camp in the dark was enough to make my hands shake as I shoved the last of my gear into my pack. I hiked back to the truck without stopping. Every sound in the forest made me turn my head, scanning for movement. It felt like I was being followed, though I never saw anyone. By the time I reached the dirt road, my nerves were frayed. I climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and didn't look back. Even now, weeks later, I think about that place, about the footprints, the dragging sound, and that narrow trench in the dirt. I don't know what it was for or who made it, but I know one thing: I won't ever camp there again. It had been months since I'd taken any real time off work, and I could feel the weight of it pressing on me every day. The noise, the traffic, the fluorescent lights in the office, all of it had been eating away at me. I decided I needed something different, something far away from people and screens. I'd been camping before, but always with friends or family. This time, I wanted to be alone. Just me, the woods, and a couple of nights without hearing anyone else's voice. I looked at a map and picked a spot I'd never been to before, a small state forest several hours away. It wasn't a popular place for tourists, at least not compared to the bigger national parks, which was exactly what I wanted. The weather forecast showed clear skies for the weekend, warm days, and cool nights. I packed my gear carefully the night before. A good tent, a sleeping bag rated for low temperatures, enough food for 3 days, a water filter, my small camping stove, a headlamp, and a knife I always carried outdoors. I double-checked everything, then tossed it into the back of my car and went to bed. The drive out was long but peaceful. I left early in the morning so I could get to the forest by midday and still have time to hike to a good campsite. Once I got off the highway, the roads became narrower, winding through farmland and scattered clusters of trees. After another hour, I reached the forest's dirt access road. The gravel crunched under my tires, dust trailing behind me. There was a small parking lot near the trailhead, big enough for maybe a dozen cars. But when I pulled in, only one other vehicle was there. An old pickup truck with a camper shell. There was no sign of its owner. I signed in at the small wooden kiosk, just like the instructions said, writing down my name, the date, and my planned return. I hoisted my pack, locked the car, and started down the trail. The air felt different immediately, cooler, heavier with the smell of pine and damp soil. The forest swallowed up the sound of the wind within minutes. The trail was narrow but well-defined, winding gently uphill at first before flattening out. I kept a steady pace, taking time to glance around at the tall trees and thick underbrush. The sun filtered down through the canopy in shifting patterns, and somewhere in the distance I could hear the faint trickle of water. After about an hour, I reached a fork in the trail. The main path continued ahead, but there was a smaller, rougher track branching off to the left. It wasn't marked on my map, but it seemed to head toward the direction of the stream I'd been hearing. I decided to take it. My boots crunched over loose rocks, and at points I had to push aside branches that reached across the trail. The air grew more humid, and before long I could hear the water more clearly. When I reached the stream, I found a spot where the ground leveled out into a small clearing. It was perfect, flat enough for my tent, with just enough space to move around, and close enough to the stream for water. I dropped my pack, took a deep breath, and began setting up camp. I cleared away any sticks and rocks, pitched my tent, and staked it down firmly. Then I unpacked my sleeping bag, set my cooking gear to one side, and filled my water bottle at the stream using the filter pump. By late afternoon, everything was in place. I sat on a fallen log, eating a simple meal of instant rice and beans, while the light began to shift toward evening. The forest felt alive in a way I couldn't experience in the city. Every few minutes, I'd hear something, a rustle in the undergrowth, the flutter of wings, a crack of a branch somewhere deep in the trees. It didn't bother me. In fact, it felt right. This was their place, and I was just a visitor. As the sun dipped lower, I lit a small campfire. I didn't need it for warmth yet, but the flickering light was comforting. When darkness finally fell, it was sudden and complete. The moon hadn't risen yet, and without it, the only light came from the flames and my headlamp. The sounds of the forest changed too. The daytime birds and insects quieted, replaced by the distant calls of night creatures. Somewhere far off, an owl hooted. I stayed up for a while, sipping water, staring into the fire, and listening. Around 10 p.m., I doused the flames completely, making sure the embers were cold, then climbed into my tent. I zipped the door shut and slid into my sleeping bag, the sound of the stream a constant background. I don't know how long I'd been asleep before I woke up. Couldn't have been more than a couple of hours. The darkness outside still felt thick. At first, I wasn't sure why I'd woken. I lay still, listening. The usual nighttime forest sounds were there, the water, a few distant chirps from insects, but then I heard something else. A short, deliberate crunch of leaves, not far from my tent. I held my breath. The sound came again, a slow step, then another. It wasn't the random rustle of an animal moving quickly through the underbrush. This was heavier, slower, like something walking with purpose. I felt my heartbeat in my throat. I reached for my headlamp, clicked it on, and the inside of the tent glowed pale. I listened again. The sound had stopped. I thought about unzipping the tent to look outside, but part of me didn't want to. If it was a deer, the light and movement would scare it off. But if it wasn't, minutes passed. I didn't hear anything else. Slowly, I convinced myself it had been nothing. Maybe a raccoon or some other small animal rummaging nearby. I turned off the light and lay back down, though sleep didn't come easily after that. The next morning, the forest was bright and calm again. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside into the cool air. Everything looked normal, but when I glanced at the ground a few feet away, I froze. There were prints in the soft soil, not boots but bare feet, large, wider than mine, and deep enough to show whoever made them was heavy. They led from the trees toward the edge of my camp, then back into the forest. I stood there for a long time, staring at them. My first thought was that maybe someone else was camping nearby and had wandered past during the night. But I hadn't seen anyone all day yesterday, and the prints were fresh, clear in the damp soil. They were too close to my tent for comfort. I made breakfast quickly, my eyes darting toward the trees every few seconds. I told myself I was overreacting. It was just another camper, maybe someone fishing in the stream. Still, I decided to keep my knife on me for the rest of the trip. The day passed quietly enough. I spent the morning hiking farther along the stream, following it until it narrowed and grew rocky. I saw no one else. By afternoon, clouds rolled in, and the air cooled. I returned to camp, gathered more wood, and prepared for another night. When it got dark, I built the fire higher than before. The flickering light reached farther into the clearing, making me feel safer. I stayed up later, too, not wanting to go to bed until I was sure I'd be able to sleep. Eventually, though I had to, I banked the fire, zipped myself into the tent, and tried to relax. Sometime after midnight, I woke again. At first, I didn't know why. Then I realized it was because it was completely silent. No insects, no water sounds, just dead quiet. My skin prickled. That's when I heard it. Not footsteps this time, but a slow scraping sound, like something being dragged across the ground. It was close, right outside my tent. I had been planning that camping trip for weeks, trying to get away from everything for a while. The city had been eating me alive with noise, traffic, and work that never seemed to end. My head felt like it was buzzing all the time. I wanted quiet, real quiet, the kind you only get when you are deep enough into the woods that the hum of the highway fades into nothing. I picked a spot I found on an old hiking forum. It wasn't an official campground. It was a clearing near a small river, a place that was far off the main trails. The kind of place you could be for days without seeing another person. That was the point. I wanted space. The morning I left, the air felt cooler than I expected. Summer was still in full swing, but a thin fog hung over the ground. I drove with the windows cracked, feeling the damp air creep inside. The closer I got to the trailhead, the more the road narrowed, until it was just a rough strip of asphalt surrounded by thick trees that leaned in over it. By the time I parked, I could hear the steady sound of running water somewhere in the distance. I slung my pack over my shoulders and started down the trail. The trail wasn't much more than a deer path, narrow and winding, with roots and rocks sticking up in places that could easily twist an ankle if I wasn't careful. The forest felt alive, not in a magical way, but in the way the air seemed to shift with each bird call, each rustle of leaves. The light was dim even though it was morning, the trees blocking most of the sun. The smell was damp earth and pine sap, mixed with that cold, mineral scent from the river. It took me over an hour to reach the clearing. It was just as I imagined. Flat enough for a tent, ringed with tall pines, and close enough to the river that I could hear the constant low rush of water. The grass there was a little higher, and the ground soft with moss in places. I dropped my pack and walked a slow circle, taking it all in. No tire tracks, no boot prints, no trash. Perfect. I set up my tent on the driest spot I could find, facing the river. My sleeping bag, food, small stove, and water filter all went inside. I worked without rushing the way I liked. Once camp was set, I filled my bottle from the river and filtered the water, sitting on a smooth boulder while I drank. The day passed slowly, the way days in the woods do when you don't have a phone buzzing every few minutes. I gathered some dry wood for the night's fire, walked along the river until the current grew too strong to wade, and sat in the shade reading. The air was still warm but heavy with the smell of wet leaves. The only odd thing was the silence from time to time, periods where all the birds stopped calling at once. I'd notice it, wait, and then the sound of the forest would slowly return. By the time the sun dipped behind the trees, the clearing was swallowed in shadows. I lit the fire, small at first, then feeding it until it was a steady orange glow. The flames cracked and spit, the sound comforting against the backdrop of the river. I cooked a simple meal and ate while the firelight flickered on the inside of my tent. That was when I heard it. It wasn't loud, but it was there. A single heavy snap of a branch somewhere beyond the edge of the clearing. I froze, staring toward the dark tree line. Could have been a deer, probably was. The forest is full of noises, most of them harmless. I forced myself to keep chewing, to act like nothing was wrong. Still, my ears strained for anything else. A minute later, there was another sound, not the light, quick steps of a deer. This was slower, measured, something moving through the underbrush with weight. I turned my head slightly, pretending to poke at the fire, but my eyes were locked on the dark. The sound stopped. I told myself not to be stupid. Animals come close to camps all the time. Most run when they catch your scent. But something about the way this thing moved didn't sit right with me. I added more wood to the fire and stayed close to it until the flames were high enough to light the first line of trees. Nothing moved. When I finally crawled into my tent, I left the fire burning low, just enough to cast a faint orange light over the clearing. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the night sounds, crickets, the river, the occasional distant owl. My eyes grew heavy. Somewhere in the middle of the night, I woke up. I didn't know why at first, but then I realized the fire had burned down to almost nothing. The clearing was dark except for the faint outline of the tent walls. And there was another sound. Breathing. Not my breathing. It was faint but close. A slow inhale and exhale, uneven, like whoever or whatever was making it was trying to stay quiet. My skin went cold. I didn't move, didn't even breathe for a moment. The sound seemed to come from just outside the tent, near my feet. I told myself again that it had to be an animal, maybe a bear sniffing around. But it didn't sound like a bear. Bears huff, snort. This sounded human. I waited, every muscle tight. The breathing continued for what felt like minutes, then stopped. I stayed still long after, my mind racing. If it was a person, why were they just standing there? If it was an animal, why was it so quiet now? Eventually, I must have drifted off again, because the next thing I knew, pale morning light was coming through the tent fabric. I unzipped the door and stepped out. The clearing looked the same. My pack was untouched. No sign anyone had been there. I told myself I imagined it, that maybe it was my own breathing I heard in some half-awake state. Still, I scanned the ground for tracks. That was when I saw them. Near the edge of the clearing, in a patch of softer soil, there were footprints. Not boots, bare feet. The prints were deep, the toes spread, the size roughly the same as mine. They led from the tree line toward the tent and then back again. My stomach turned cold. I spent the day unsettled, wandering only short distances from camp. I kept thinking about the prints, about the breathing. The forest felt different now. Less like a place to relax, more like a place that could swallow you without a trace. That night, I built the fire higher and kept it burning late. I sat with my back to my tent, watching the dark. Hours passed, the forest alive with its usual chorus. But sometime after midnight, it happened again. A sound, soft at first, then more distinct. Slow footsteps in the underbrush, circling, always just beyond the reach of the firelight. I could feel the hair on my arms rising. I didn't move. The steps paused, then resumed, shifting closer to the tent. I gripped the handle of the hatchet I kept beside me. The footsteps stopped again. Silence. Then a faint scraping, like something brushing against the fabric of the tent. My chest tightened. I stayed exactly where I was, eyes locked on the tent wall where the sound had come from. After what felt like forever, the noise faded. I didn't sleep. Morning brought no new tracks, no sign of anything disturbed. But I knew I hadn't imagined it. Something or someone was coming into camp at night, moving just close enough to remind me I wasn't alone. I should have packed up right then, but part of me didn't want to be chased out. I had come here to be away from people, to be alone. Now it felt like the woods were testing me. The third night was the worst. I was lying in my tent, the fire burned down, when I heard the first step. This time it was closer, heavier. I held still, my ears straining. The steps circled the tent once, slow and deliberate. I could hear the faint crunch of pine needles under bare feet. Then, without warning, the sound was right beside me. A shadow passed over the thin tent wall, blotting out what little moonlight there was. I could see the outline, tall, narrow shoulders, a head bent slightly forward. Whoever it was just stood there. I didn't move, barely breathed. The shadow lingered for several long seconds, then slowly shifted away. I waited until the sound of footsteps faded completely before I moved. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. When dawn came, I broke camp. I didn't stop to eat, didn't even bother folding the tent properly. I just stuffed it into my pack and headed back toward the trailhead. Every few minutes, I glanced behind me, half expecting to see someone following. When I finally reached the car, I threw my pack inside and locked the doors. As I pulled onto the road, I caught one last glimpse of the tree line in the rearview mirror. For a second, I thought I saw a figure standing there, just at the edge of the shadows, watching. I didn't slow down. I never went back. I had been planning this camping trip for weeks. It was supposed to be a quiet, simple break from the noise of the city. Just me, my gear, and the forest. I picked a spot deep inside a national forest where I knew there wouldn't be many people. The map showed a trail that wasn't heavily used, and from there, I could follow a smaller unmarked path to a clearing by a narrow river bend. I liked the idea of being far from anyone else. No traffic, no people, no lights, just the sound of wind through the trees and water moving past the rocks. I left my car at a small gravel parking area just before noon. The weather was warm but not too hot, with scattered clouds and the kind of air that smells of pine and damp soil. My backpack was heavier than I liked, but I had packed enough food, water, and gear to last 2 nights. I figured that once I set up camp, I wouldn't need to move much except to gather firewood or maybe explore a little. The hike in wasn't hard, but the trail narrowed quickly after the first mile. The further I went, the less sign there was of other hikers. No footprints in the dirt, no cut branches, nothing that looked fresh. At one point, I saw a small deer dart away into the underbrush, the sound of its hooves fading quickly. I took that as a good sign. Wildlife meant peace, no loud groups of campers around. After another half hour, I stepped off the main trail onto a faint path barely visible between tall grass and scattered fallen branches. This was the part one had seen on the map, though in person it looked less like a path and more like a game trail animals might use. I followed it carefully, pushing past low-hanging branches and sidestepping rocks hidden under thick leaves. It took about 20 minutes of this before the trees opened into the clearing I had been aiming for. The place was perfect. A flat patch of soft dirt and moss sat right beside the river bend. The water here was calm, only moving fast enough to carry the occasional floating leaf downstream. Across the water was a steep hill covered in thick pine, their shadows stretching long over the bank. I could see no sign of anyone. No trash, no old campfire rings, nothing disturbed. Just the sound of the river and the occasional rustle of leaves in the light breeze. I dropped my pack and took a moment to breathe it in. The silence was deep here, the kind that feels heavier than normal. Even birdsong was faint and distant. I pitched my small tent facing the river, unpacked my sleeping bag, and set my little foldable chair by the water. After gathering a small pile of dry branches for a fire later, I sat and let the sun warm my face. For most of the afternoon, I did nothing but watch the water. Around 5, I boiled some water for instant noodles, eating slowly as the air cooled. The sky turned orange behind the trees, and the wind picked up just enough to ripple the surface of the river. That's when I noticed it, the first small thing. Across the water, about 20 yards upstream, I saw movement. At first, I thought it was just a branch swaying, but then I realized it was something dark and low to the ground, moving between the trees. I squinted, trying to make it out, but the fading light made it hard to see clearly. It was gone within seconds, slipping behind a tree. I brushed it off as maybe a raccoon or fox, but it left me watching the treeline longer than I meant to. When night fell, the forest grew colder fast. I lit my fire, feeding it small pieces of wood to keep the flames steady without wasting fuel. The glow cast shadows over the clearing, making the trees seem taller and the darkness between them deeper. I tried to enjoy the sound of the river, but I kept glancing toward the spot where I'd seen the movement earlier. It wasn't until I was about to turn in for the night that I heard the second thing. A sharp crack, like a heavy branch snapping, came from the opposite bank. Not the random pop of wood in the fire, not the gentle shifting of trees in the wind. This was heavier, like something stepped on it. I froze in my chair, listening. The river wasn't loud enough to cover the sound, but nothing followed. No footsteps, no splashing, just silence. I got into my tent, zipped it up, and tried to tell myself it was just another deer. The sound of water and the occasional whisper of wind in the branches lulled me, but I didn't sleep deeply. Every time I shifted, I found myself listening for something. Sometime in the night, I woke up to an unfamiliar noise. It was faint, but steady, like a slow scraping. My first thought was that it was my imagination, but when I held my breath, I could still hear it. It sounded like it was coming from across the river. I turned onto my side, straining to listen. The scraping stopped suddenly, replaced by a quiet splash, like a single step into shallow water. Then silence again. I stayed awake for at least another hour before drifting off, my sleeping bag pulled up to my chin. The next morning, the clearing looked normal, but I felt off. My shoulders were tense, my stomach unsettled. I boiled water for coffee, keeping my eyes on the opposite bank. The sun made it easier to see, but there was nothing there now, no movement, no sound but the river. I decided to explore upstream a little, maybe get my mind off the unease. I walked about 100 yards along the bank, pushing through low brush until I found a spot where the trees across the river opened slightly. That's when I saw something that made my skin tighten. On the opposite shore, in the mud just beyond the waterline, were prints. Not boot prints, not anything neat or clear, just deep, irregular impressions, as if something heavy had been standing there, shifting its weight. They weren't shaped like deer hooves or paw prints. They looked almost like the rough outline of a foot, but wider, and the heel was deeper than the rest. I stepped closer to the edge, staring at them. There were 3 distinct prints, leading from the trees to the water. The ones closest to the water were slightly filled in, as if they'd been there overnight and caught some splash from the river. I felt a slow shiver work its way up my back. The rest of the day I tried to relax, but I kept glancing upstream. The forest that had felt so calm yesterday now seemed to hold something behind its quiet. I collected more firewood, ate a cold lunch, and sat in my chair watching the water again. The sun dipped lower, shadows stretching long across the river. Just before dark, I heard another sound, this time from downstream. A low, deliberate splash, like someone stepping carefully into water. I looked toward it, but by the time I focused, there was nothing but ripples moving away from the shore. That night, I couldn't settle. I kept the fire going longer than I needed to, the crackle and light giving me some comfort. When I finally crawled into my tent, I left my boots inside, ready to pull them on if I needed to. It must have been after midnight when I woke to a new sound. This one was closer, a slow, steady movement through water, like something walking across the river bend toward my side. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. The steps were unhurried, deliberate, and they didn't splash wildly. Whoever or whatever it was knew how to move quietly. The sound stopped before reaching my bank. I lay there, staring into the darkness of the tent, my hand gripping the zipper in case I had to bolt. Then came the soft crunch of wet dirt just outside the water. My skin prickled. It was close enough that I could feel the presence on my side of the river now. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The sound of something shifting its weight in the dirt came once, then again. Then silence. I don't know how long I stayed frozen, waiting for another sound. Eventually, my body ached from tension, and my eyelids grew heavy. When I woke again, pale light was filtering through the tent walls. Outside, the dirt near my camp was disturbed. A faint trail of impressions led from the water's edge toward the trees behind my tent, then vanished into the underbrush. They weren't deep, but they were fresh. I didn't bother with breakfast. I packed everything quickly, barely taking time to roll my sleeping bag, and stuffed it all into my backpack. As I hiked out, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see movement behind me. When I finally reached my car and locked the doors, the air inside felt stifling, but safe. I sat there for a while before starting the engine, my hands tight on the wheel. I don't know what I saw or what had been watching me, but I know it wasn't just an animal passing through. The way it moved, the way it stayed just far enough to keep me guessing, it felt intentional. And I know I won't be camping alone there again. It was late September when I decided to take a weekend trip out into the woods alone. The summer heat had finally started to fade, and the nights were getting cooler. I'd been feeling trapped in the city for months, surrounded by noise and concrete, and I needed some space to clear my head. I had been camping before, but always with other people. This time I wanted it to be just me, away from everyone, with no distractions except the sound of wind in the trees and the crackle of a campfire. I left early in the morning, my car packed with everything I thought I might need. My tent, a sleeping bag, a camping stove, a lantern, a small cooler with food, a first aid kit, and a hunting knife I'd bought years ago but never actually used. My plan was to set up camp somewhere deep enough into the forest that I wouldn't run into other people, but not so far that I couldn't get back to my car quickly if something went wrong. The drive took about 2 hours. The farther I got from the city, the more the roads narrowed and the denser the trees became. I pulled off onto a dirt road that wound deeper into the forest, the kind of road where you feel every bump through the steering wheel. By the time I parked, there was nothing around me but trees and the sound of leaves rustling in the breeze. The air smelled different out there, cleaner, sharper, with that earthy scent of damp soil and pine needles. I slung my backpack over my shoulders and started walking. I followed an old trail for a while, then veered off into the thicker woods. I wanted to be far enough from the trail that no one would accidentally wander into my campsite. It took me about 40 minutes of steady walking to find a spot that felt right. A small clearing surrounded by tall pines and birches, with the ground fairly level and dry. It was close to a narrow stream, which meant I'd have water nearby if I needed it. Setting up camp took longer than I expected. The ground was littered with sticks and pine cones, and I had to clear them away before pitching my tent. The tent itself was a little stubborn. It always was, but eventually I got it standing, staked down securely. I unrolled my sleeping bag inside and set the cooler and my gear just outside the tent flap. I gathered some dry wood and built a small fire ring with stones from around the clearing. By the time everything was in place, the sun was already starting to dip behind the trees, and the light had that golden, fading quality that lasts only a short while before dusk takes over. I boiled some water on the camp stove and made instant noodles. They tasted better than I remembered, probably because I'd worked up an appetite hauling all my gear and setting up. The forest got quiet as night came. I noticed it gradually, how the bird calls stopped, how the wind seemed to slow. It wasn't silent, not exactly, but the sounds were different. Every so often I heard something small moving through the underbrush somewhere out there, probably just squirrels or raccoons. I sat by the fire, feeding it small pieces of wood, feeling the heat on my face and the cool air on my back. When full dark came, the temperature dropped fast. I pulled on a jacket and sat watching the fire burn lower. The forest felt huge and close at the same time, the trees like black silhouettes against a deep blue sky. I kept glancing at the edges of the clearing, thinking I saw movement, but it was always just branches swaying or shadows shifting. Eventually, I put out the fire, double-checking that every ember was dead, and crawled into my tent. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the faint trickle of the stream and the occasional snap of a twig outside. It took me a while to fall asleep, but when I finally did, it was deep. Sometime in the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. The inside of the tent was dark, and the air felt colder. I lay still, my ears straining. That's when I heard it. A steady, slow crunch of leaves and twigs, somewhere close. It didn't sound like the quick, darting steps of a small animal. These were heavier, more deliberate. I held my breath and listened. The sound stopped. The silence after was worse because I couldn't tell if whatever it was had left or was standing there, listening too. My hand crept toward the hunting knife I'd kept near the sleeping bag, my fingers wrapping around the handle. For a long time, nothing happened. My heartbeat was loud in my ears. Eventually, I told myself it must have been a deer or something, and I forced myself to relax enough to fall asleep again. The next morning, I stepped out of the tent and saw them. Footprints. They were faint, but they were there, in the damp soil just beyond the fire pit. Not animal prints, shoe prints. I knelt down, my stomach tightening. The tread wasn't familiar, not mine. They were pointed toward the tent, then away, disappearing into the trees. I didn't see anyone all day, though I kept scanning the forest as I moved around. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it could have been another camper passing through, but it didn't explain why they'd come so close to my tent in the middle of the night without saying anything. I spent the day hiking around, collecting more wood, and keeping the fire going. The daylight made it easier to feel safe, but I kept thinking about those footprints. I decided I'd stay one more night but be more alert. That night, I left the fire burning longer, hoping the light might keep anything, or anyone, away. I sat with my back to a tree, the knife on my lap, listening. The forest seemed quieter than the night before. Too quiet. It was close to midnight when I heard it again. The crunch of footsteps, slow and measured, coming from the same direction as before. This time, I didn't wait. I turned on my lantern and aimed the beam toward the sound. The light cut through the darkness, hitting the trees and bushes. Nothing moved. I stayed awake the rest of the night, my eyes burning from exhaustion, but nothing else happened. By morning, I'd made up my mind to pack up and leave. When I walked back to my car, I kept glancing behind me. The whole time, I had the feeling I wasn't alone. The trail felt longer than before, and every sound in the woods made me tighten my grip on the knife. When I reached the car, there was something tucked under the windshield wiper, a folded piece of paper. My stomach dropped. I unfolded it with shaking hands. It was blank, just a plain piece of paper. But the fact that it was there, in the middle of nowhere, told me everything I needed to know. Someone had been out there watching me. Someone had walked right up to my car while I was sleeping in the woods. I got in, locked the doors, and drove until I saw the first gas station. I didn't stop until I was back in the city, surrounded by noise and people, but the whole way back I kept checking my mirrors. Even now, I can't shake the thought that whoever it was might have followed me out of those woods. I had been planning the trip for months, studying maps, checking the weather patterns, and reading whatever I could about the area. It wasn't a tourist camping site with maintained trails or nearby rangers. This was deep backcountry, the kind of place where if something went wrong, help would be days away. That was exactly what I wanted. I wanted the quiet, the isolation, the absence of human noise. I parked my old truck at the far end of a dirt access road, the kind that gets narrower the further you drive it. The sides of the road scraped at my mirrors and low branches brushed the roof. I killed the engine and just listened for a second. No hum of traffic, no voices, no faraway farm machinery. Just the faint rustle of wind through pine needles and the distant rush of water somewhere downhill. I grabbed my pack from the back, heavier than I liked but packed with enough food for 5 days. A tent, sleeping bag, extra clothes, a small hatchet, and a lightweight stove. My boots crunched on the gravel as I locked the truck and slung the pack over my shoulders. The air had that faint resin smell from sun-warmed pines, mixed with the damp scent of soil. The hike in was longer than I remembered from my planning. The trail, if you could call it that, was just a faint depression in the ground, sometimes vanishing under a carpet of needles. I followed the lay of the land more than any markers, working my way along a ridgeline and then dropping down toward a narrow valley where I knew there'd be water. By the time I reached the small clearing I'd chosen on the map, the sun had dropped lower, casting long shadows between the trees. The stream I'd heard earlier ran about 50 feet from where I planned to set up. I could still see the rippling silver through the trees. I pitched my tent on a flat patch of earth, cleared of sticks and rocks, then went down to the water with my filter pump to fill my bottles. The stream was icy cold, biting my fingers. The first night was uneventful. I cooked a small meal of rice and jerky, listened to the night insects, and lay in my tent staring at the thin fabric glowing faintly in the moonlight. The occasional rustle in the underbrush outside didn't bother me. Small animals were always moving. The second day I explored. The valley deepened further east, the stream cutting through a series of shallow pools. I found scat near the water, deer, maybe elk. Higher up, I saw tracks that didn't belong to deer. Wide pads, heavy, possibly a black bear. I took note and stayed alert. By late afternoon, clouds had rolled in. I could smell rain before it started, that cool, metallic tang in the air. I gathered some extra dry wood and kept it under the edge of my rainfly, but when the downpour came, it came hard. I stayed in my tent, listening to the steady drumming on the nylon, the sound muffling everything else. That night, I woke up once, unsure why. The rain had stopped, and the air was so still it felt like a held breath. Then I heard it, something moving in the distance. Not the skitter of a squirrel or the quick hops of a rabbit. This was heavier, slower, deliberate. I lay there, eyes open in the dark, my heart beating in my ears. Passed eventually, whatever it was, and I told myself it was probably a deer coming to drink from the stream. The third day was when things started feeling wrong. I left camp mid-morning to scout further downstream, following the water until it widened into a quiet bend surrounded by boulders. I noticed prints in the soft mud, not fresh, but deep enough to have held their shape through the rain. Again, the same wide pads, bigger than the last ones I saw. When I returned to camp that afternoon, something caught my attention immediately. My cook pot was on the ground a few feet from where I'd left it. It had been licked clean. I always cleaned my cookware before storing it in my pack, but I'd left it out to dry under the fly. Now there were marks, smears that weren't mine. My stomach sank. I spent that night more alert, every little noise pulling me halfway out of sleep. Several times I thought I heard breathing outside the tent, but when I strained my ears, it would fade into the wind. By the fourth day, I decided to change my camp routine. I moved my food and cookware about 30 feet from the tent and suspended them in a tree using my bear bag rope. The valley felt different that morning. It wasn't anything I could see. It was the absence of sound. No birdsong, no chatter of squirrels. Even the stream seemed quieter, as if the whole place was holding itself still. That evening, while I was sitting by a small fire, I caught movement near the tree line. A flicker of shape, then nothing. I turned my head slowly, scanning between trunks. The hair on my arms lifted. I didn't see anything else, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me. I decided to let the fire burn longer than usual, feeding it until the wood popped and hissed. I must have dozed off at some point because I woke up to darkness and the faint red glow of embers. My neck was stiff from the way I'd been sitting. I stirred the coals, throwing on a couple of small sticks, and that's when I heard it, movement closer than before. This time, there was no mistaking it. Heavy, slow steps on damp earth. I didn't move. My hand went to the handle of the hatchet lying beside me. The steps stopped, then started again, circling. I saw nothing in the dark, but the sound was real and deliberate. It stayed outside the ring of firelight, pacing. Eventually, it retreated. I barely slept. At first light, I found new prints in the mud just beyond the camp's edge. They were fresher this time, deep enough that water still glistened inside. I made the decision to leave that day. 5 days had been the plan, but I saw no reason to risk one more night. I packed quickly, keeping my ears open. The forest felt alive in a different way now, not peaceful but watching. Halfway back toward the truck, I stopped to rest and drink. That's when I realized the silence was following me. Birds and insects stayed absent. My mind kept flicking back to the sound of those steps pacing in the dark. I didn't run, but my pace quickened. When I finally saw the glint of my truck through the trees, relief hit me like a wave. I tossed my pack in the bed, climbed in, and locked the doors. The moment the engine turned over, the forest seemed to exhale behind me. As I drove down the narrow dirt road, I thought about those prints, the pacing, the way it had stayed just beyond the light. It had never charged or made noise meant to scare me. It had simply watched. That thought stayed with me all the way home. The idea that for 4 nights, I had been the thing in the woods that didn't belong, and something out there had known it from the moment I arrived. The air was heavy when I parked the truck at the end of the narrow dirt road. The kind of heavy that presses against your skin and makes you feel like the forest is holding its breath. I'd been looking forward to this camping trip for weeks. Just me, my pack, and the quiet. But as I cut the engine and listened to the way the silence closed in, I felt something I couldn't quite name. It wasn't fear. Not yet. More like my body was trying to warn me of something I hadn't seen. The trail started as a thin ribbon between the trees, dry leaves breaking under my boots with each step. My backpack dug into my shoulders, and sweat was already starting to form at my back. The forest smelled damp, though it hadn't rained in a while. I kept a steady pace, my eyes adjusting to the shifting light as the canopy thickened. Every now and then I'd hear the snap of a twig somewhere off to the side, but I brushed it off as squirrels or deer. I hiked for about 2 hours before finding the spot I'd picked out on the map. A small clearing with a slight slope, high enough to avoid pooling water if it rained, but flat enough to pitch a tent. The nearest water source, a narrow creek, was maybe 100 yards away. I set my pack down and took a slow look around, checking for any signs of human use. No fire pits, no leftover trash. Good. Setting up camp was quick. The tent went up first, then I unrolled my sleeping bag inside and stashed my food in a sealed container, which I hung from a sturdy branch about 15 feet off the ground. I'd had a run-in with raccoons before and didn't want to repeat. The sun still sat high in the sky, so I took my time gathering some dry wood and stacking it for later. By late afternoon, the forest had shifted. The air cooled slightly, and the chorus of distant bird calls changed to something softer, more spaced out. I walked to the creek with my water filter and filled my bottles, kneeling on the muddy bank as the current whispered by. A few minnows darted near my shadow, and a dragonfly hovered in the air, its wings flickering in the light. It was peaceful, but even here I noticed how sound traveled strangely. I could hear things far away, branches falling, leaves rustling, but they seemed muted, like they were behind a thin wall. When I got back to camp, I lit a small fire and cooked a simple meal: rice, beans, a bit of jerky. The smell of smoke clung to my clothes, and I kept the flames low so as not to draw unnecessary attention. As the sun dipped behind the ridge, shadows stretched across the clearing. The forest cooled faster now, and my breath started to show faintly in the air. I pulled my jacket on and sat by the fire, listening to the night settle in. It began with the normal sounds: crickets, a faint breeze, the occasional creak of a tree shifting. But after a while, I noticed something off. The insects were quiet on one side of the clearing. On my right, they sang their constant high-pitched songs, but to my left, there was nothing. Just an empty silence, thick enough to notice. I stared into the darkness that way, but the trees looked the same as they had before. I told myself to relax, that I'd come out here to be alone, and now I had exactly what I wanted. But my body wouldn't settle. My muscles stayed tense even when I lay in the tent later. The fire burned low outside, the fabric walls shifting with the occasional gust of wind. Somewhere in the distance, I heard it. A heavy, deliberate step, then another. Not the quick, scattered movement of a deer or raccoon. This was slower, heavier, almost cautious. My heart began to thud in my chest. I lay perfectly still, straining to hear through the layers of nylon and the dull hiss of my own breath. The steps didn't continue. They just stopped. I waited for what felt like forever before the night sounds began to creep back. Eventually, I closed my eyes, though sleep came only in short, restless bursts. Every time I woke, I'd listen, expecting those footsteps again. The next morning, the forest looked harmless. Bright sunlight filtered through the leaves, painting everything in a soft gold. I shook off the unease, brewed some coffee on my small stove, and decided to hike farther upstream along the creek. The trail was faint and sometimes vanished entirely, forcing me to weave between trees and step over fallen logs. The ground was damp in places, leaving clear impressions when I stepped in the mud. About 30 minutes in, I saw something that made me pause. Other tracks. They weren't boot prints, and they weren't the hoof marks of deer. These were broad, with a defined heel and a spread of toes, human in shape but bare. They were fresh too. The edges were sharp, the mud still moist. I crouched to study them, my mind running through explanations. Maybe a local out here fishing. Maybe they'd camped nearby. But something about the way the prints wandered off into the thick brush without following the creek made my skin prickle. I kept going, but slower now, my ears tuned to every sound. After another hour, I turned back toward camp, uneasy about being away for too long. When I got back, everything looked as I'd left it, but I checked my food bag anyway, still hanging. No signs of tampering. That night, the fire felt smaller, the trees taller. I kept glancing toward the same patch of darkness on the left side of camp. I couldn't explain why, but that's where my attention kept pulling. I let the fire burn longer this time, feeding it slowly until the wood pile was nearly gone. I was drifting towards sleep when I heard it again. The steps, this time closer. They were moving around the edge of the clearing, slow and measured, just beyond the reach of the firelight. I froze, every muscle locked. The steps stopped for a long moment, and then came the sound of something brushing against a tree, like a hand sliding across the bark. I didn't move until dawn. When light finally crept in, I unzipped the tent and stepped out. I walked to where I'd heard the sounds and scanned the ground. That's when I saw it. Another barefoot print, half in mud, half in the soft earth. The toes were splayed, the heel deep. It was facing toward my camp. I considered packing up right then, but part of me didn't want to be chased out. I'd planned to stay 3 nights, and this was only the second. I told myself I was overreacting, that it was probably just some drifter or maybe even a curious kid from a nearby property. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The final night was the worst. I kept the fire big, feeding it with every stick and log I could find. The night air was cold, but sweat clung to my neck and back. Hours passed, and nothing happened. I began to think maybe it was done, that whoever or whatever it was had moved on. Then, from the tree line, I heard the faintest sound of breathing. Slow, steady, like someone trying to control it. My chest tightened. I scanned the shadows, but the firelight only reached so far. The sound stopped, and then a single footstep came forward. Not a deer, not a bear, too deliberate. I stayed by the fire until morning, too afraid to sleep. When the first gray light touched the clearing, I packed everything as fast as I could. My hands shook as I worked, and I kept looking over my shoulder toward the silent patch of forest. As I hoisted my pack and started down the trail, I felt it, that same watching presence. I didn't turn around. I kept walking, faster than before, my boots crunching over leaves, the sound loud in the stillness. When I reached the truck and slammed the door shut, the forest still stood there, quiet and unmoving. I don't know if I was followed, but as I drove away, the feeling only began to fade once the trees finally broke and the road opened up to the empty stretch of asphalt beyond. I never went back. It was late summer when I decided to take a solo camping trip. The days were still hot, but the nights were starting to carry that faint chill that hinted at the coming fall. I had been feeling suffocated in the city for weeks, surrounded by noise, screens, and people I didn't want to be around. I wanted quiet, real quiet, the kind that only exists far from roads, streetlights, and cell towers. I picked a spot deep in the mountains, a place I had marked on a map months earlier but never gotten around to visiting. There was no established campground there, just a clearing near a slow-moving creek, several miles from the nearest trailhead. I parked my truck in a small gravel pull-off at the end of a rough dirt road. From there, I hiked with my pack for nearly 3 hours, pushing through overgrown switchbacks and rocky inclines until the trees opened into a patch of grass near the water. It was the kind of place that felt untouched. No trash, no fire rings, no trampled dirt paths, just wild grass, scattered stones, and the steady gurgle of the creek. The air was different here, heavy with the smell of pine and wet soil. The sound of the water mixed with the distant rustle of wind in the branches. Felt perfect. I set my pack down, stretched, and walked a slow circle through the clearing, taking in the lay of the land. The creek was narrow but deep in parts, with smooth rocks and dark pools. Across it, the terrain rose steeply into dense forest. Behind my chosen spot, the trees were a mix of pine and aspen, tall and close together, their trunks forming long shadows on the grass. I set up my tent on a flat section close enough to the water to hear it, but far enough to avoid the damp chill of the creek bed. I laid out my sleeping bag, unpacked my stove and food, and stacked my small pile of dry wood. By late afternoon, I had everything organized. I ate a light meal, took off my boots, and sat with my feet in the cold creek, watching the sunlight slide lower through the branches. The stillness out here was almost a physical thing. Every sound carried, birds calling from high in the trees, the plop of a fish breaking the surface, the faint creak of trunks swaying. I felt more alone than I had in years, and at that moment it felt like a good thing. As the sun sank, I built a small fire. I sat beside it, letting the warmth soak into my legs as the light faded. The trees became dark shapes against the last glow of the sky, and the creek's voice seemed louder in the stillness. I stayed there until the fire burned down to red embers, then crawled into my tent. The night was colder than I expected. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the soft movement of water and the occasional rustle of leaves. At some point, I drifted into a light sleep. It must have been around midnight when I woke. My first thought was that I'd heard something, a faint sound, not from the creek or the wind. I stayed still, my ears straining. It came again, a light crunch, like weight pressing onto dry grass or leaves. It wasn't near the tent, but not far either, maybe somewhere between the creek and the trees behind me. I told myself it was probably a deer. Out here, animals moved at night constantly. I shifted in my bag, closed my eyes again, and tried to let the sound of the creek pull me back under. But then I heard another noise, heavier this time. A slow, deliberate step, then another. It was the pace that bothered me. Not the quick, uncertain movement of a startled animal, but something slower. I pulled my sleeping bag tighter around me and lay completely still, hardly breathing. The steps stopped. I listened for a long time, the darkness pressing in around me. Eventually, I convinced myself it was nothing, an animal moving off into the woods. I forced myself to relax, my breathing evening out until I drifted off again. When I woke, the tent was faintly lit by the gray-blue light of early dawn. The first thing I noticed was that my fire pit, which I had left as cold embers, looked disturbed. Some of the wood I had stacked beside it was scattered a few feet away. I walked slowly toward it, scanning the ground. There were marks in the dirt, but the grass and pine needles made it hard to tell exactly what had been here. I spent most of the morning exploring the area, keeping within sight of camp. The forest floor was soft and uneven, broken by patches of rock and fallen branches. Now and then, I'd think I heard something in the trees, a faint snap or crunch, but when I stopped to listen, there was nothing. By midday, the temperature rose, and I decided to take a swim in the creek. The water was shockingly cold, but it woke me up and cleared my head. I sat afterward on a sun-warmed rock, drying off and watching the current curl around stones. That afternoon, I hiked upstream for about an hour, keeping to the water's edge. I found fresh animal tracks in the mud, likely elk or deer. No sign of people. When I got back to camp, the light was already beginning to shift toward evening. I made a bigger fire this time, cooked a meal, and sat watching the flames until the air grew cold again. It was deeper into the night when I woke again. This time, there was no question about the sound. It was close, maybe 10 or 15 feet from my tent. A slow, steady movement through the grass. My mouth went dry. I stayed still, my heart thudding in my ears. The steps paused, then came again, moving in a slow arc around the tent. I could hear the faint swish of fabric as something brushed against the outer walls. Every muscle in my body was tense. I reached slowly for the handle of my hatchet, which I kept beside my sleeping bag. The sound moved past the tent and toward the creek, then faded. I lay there for hours, unable to sleep, every small noise sounding like it was right outside. When dawn finally came, I unzipped the tent and stepped into the cold morning air. The grass was wet with dew, and the fire pit was undisturbed this time. But near the edge of camp, close to where the trees began, I saw something that stopped me cold. A set of footprints in the soft dirt. They were faint but unmistakable, human, bare feet, the toes splayed wide. I felt a wave of unease that didn't leave as I packed my gear. I'd planned to stay 2 more nights, but I couldn't shake the thought of someone walking barefoot through my camp in the dark. I hiked back to the truck, every snap of a twig behind me making my skin prickle. I didn't look back until I reached the trailhead. When I drove away, the clearing by the creek disappeared behind the trees, silent again except for the sound of water. I never went back. I had been planning the trip for weeks, thinking it would be the kind of escape I needed from the noise of daily life. The idea was simple: 3 nights in the mountains, away from traffic, away from phones, away from people. I'd picked a spot about 7 miles off the nearest trailhead, deep enough into the forest that I wouldn't see anyone unless they were deliberately going that far. I had camped alone before, but never this deep, and never for more than 2 nights. The weather forecast looked perfect: clear skies, cool nights, no rain. I packed everything carefully. My small tent, a thick sleeping bag, enough food for the trip, my small camp stove, extra batteries for my flashlight, and a survival knife I always carried when camping. The hike in was tiring, but the scenery made it worth it. The trees were thick, their branches high above, letting in patches of sunlight that shifted slowly as the day went on. The ground was uneven, scattered with roots and stones that made me watch every step. A couple of times I caught movement in my peripheral vision, probably a deer or a squirrel, but the forest swallowed sound so well it was impossible to tell how close anything actually was. By the time I reached the spot I'd chosen, a small clearing near a slow-moving creek, I was drenched in sweat and my legs felt heavy. The clearing was perfect, about 30 feet across, surrounded by tall pines, with the creek only 20 steps away. The water was shallow and clear, moving just enough to keep from going stagnant. I pitched my tent near the edge of the clearing, close enough to hear the water at night, but far enough that I wouldn't worry about flooding if it rained. I gathered some fallen branches for a small fire, not for cooking, but just to have light in the evenings. The first day was uneventful. I boiled water from the creek, cooked a packet of dried food, and watched the sun go down behind the trees. The forest grew darker faster than I expected, and the air cooled quickly. I sat near the small fire, listening to the faint crackle and the occasional splash from the creek. Every so often, there'd be a faint rustling in the woods, but it wasn't enough to make me nervous. Out here, there's always something moving: rabbits, birds, raccoons. When I finally crawled into my sleeping bag, I felt tired but calm. I woke up once during the night to the sound of something moving near the creek. It was slow, deliberate, and heavy enough that it didn't sound like a small animal. I sat up, unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The moonlight gave me only vague shapes, shadows shifting as the wind moved the branches. I didn't see anything, but the sound stopped almost as soon as I moved. After a few minutes, I zipped the tent back up and tried to sleep, telling myself it was probably a deer coming for water. The second day was warmer, and I decided to explore a bit upstream. The creek twisted and narrowed as it went, and in some places it was nothing but a trickle over rocks. I found tracks in the mud, a mix of deer prints and something larger. They were wide, with long toes, and I figured they belonged to a black bear. That was common enough in these mountains, but I made a mental note to keep my food sealed and far from my tent at night. When I got back to camp, something felt different. The fire pit I had made looked disturbed. The ashes and half-burned sticks were scattered, as if something had walked right through them. A couple of my branches for kindling were missing from the small pile I'd collected. I looked around, scanning the tree line, but nothing moved. No sound, no hint of what had been there. That night, I didn't bother with a fire. I cooked early, cleaned up, and stored all my food in a bag I hung from a tree about 50 feet away. I sat in the tent for a while, listening to the forest get quieter, the way it always does before full darkness sets in. But something about the silence felt heavier, like the trees themselves were holding their breath. It must have been around midnight when I woke again, this time to a sharper sound, something snapping. Not just a twig underfoot, but a branch, loud enough to echo through the clearing. My heart started beating faster as I reached for my flashlight and the knife I kept next to me. I stayed still, trying to listen past the pounding in my ears. Another snap came, closer this time. I flicked the flashlight on and pointed it toward the sound, but the beam only reached so far. The edges of the clearing were just a wall of black. I stayed awake for hours after that, the flashlight in one hand, the knife in the other. I didn't hear anything else for a while, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me. When I finally drifted off, it was almost morning. On the third day, I debated cutting the trip short. Something about the place no longer felt right. But I told myself I was overreacting. I had planned 3 nights, and I didn't want to leave early over some noises in the dark. Still, I spent most of the day on edge, scanning the trees for movement, checking my food bag more often than needed. In the late afternoon, I decided to refill my water supply. As I knelt by the creek, I noticed fresh prints in the mud again, in the same spot I had seen them before. They looked the same shape and size, but fresher, so fresh that the edges were still collapsing into the water. I followed them a short way before they veered into the forest. That was when I saw something that made my stomach tighten. The bark on one of the pines had been stripped away in long, deep claw marks. They were high up, much higher than I could reach even if I stretched. Back at camp, I checked the food bag again. It was untouched, but the branch it hung from swayed slightly even though there was no wind. I told myself it was just my imagination, but my hands were shaking when I lowered it to check. I decided to make a bigger fire that night, figuring the light and smoke might keep anything curious away. The fire burned bright for a while, and I sat close to it, trying to relax. But sometime after midnight, the sounds came again. Slow, deliberate steps circling just outside the firelight. I could hear them crunching on dry leaves, stopping for long moments before moving again. My eyes kept darting to the edges of the light, expecting to catch a glimpse of movement, but there was nothing. Then, without warning, something crashed through the underbrush, fast and heavy, but it didn't come into the clearing. It stopped just out of sight. The air felt thick, and I realized I had stopped breathing properly, holding my breath without meaning to. I didn't move. The fire crackled, but I hardly heard it over the pounding in my chest. After a few minutes, the sound faded into the distance, and I forced myself to breathe again. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. As soon as the first light touched the clearing, I started packing. I moved quickly, shoving my gear into my backpack, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. The forest felt too quiet again, as if it was waiting for me to make a mistake. The hike back felt longer than it had coming in. Every sound made me turn my head, branches creaking, birds flying up from the brush, my own footsteps sounding too loud. At one point, I was sure I heard something pacing me off to the right, but I didn't look for long. I just kept walking, faster than before, my shoulders aching from the weight of my pack. When I finally reached the trailhead and saw my car, I felt my whole body unclench. I threw the pack in the back seat, got in, and locked the doors before even starting the engine. As I drove away, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something step out of the trees. I never saw what had been out there. Maybe it was just a bear, curious and cautious. Maybe it was something else entirely. Someone living out there, watching from the dark. I'll never know. But I do know this. I won't camp alone that deep again. Out there, in the silence, you realize just how far away help really is. And sometimes, you don't need to see the thing watching you to know it's there.